Urban legends, horror stories. I took the job because it sounded like a joke, and I needed somewhere quiet to edit a month's worth of audio. The ranger who handed me the keys called it house sitting with a stipend. 48 hours alone in Ward 11, a shuttered outpost where the forest boundary buckled inward like a bow and an old fire tower jabbed at the clouds. I told myself I wanted the silence, the real kind, the kind thick with air and trees, the kind you can lay under a waveform and hear the plug-in fail to touch. It didn't hurt that my apartment windows rattled every time the tram scraped past, or that I had started waking up with the taste of dust in the back of my throat like a childhood basement had grown inside my lungs. The road curled off the highway and turned to cracked asphalt, then to gravel, then to two thin ruts, ribboning through black spruce and white birch. It was late afternoon, and a wet light hung in the trees as if rain had backed up and pooled midair. On the passenger seat, my recorder case smacked the door with every washboard bend. Ward 11, the wooden mileage sign said, hand-lettered, the letters scarred and filled with tar like healed wounds. I found it behind a windbreak of pines, a low, shingled building with a wraparound porch and a stovepipe like a wrist bone. Beyond it, the fire tower leaned in the posture of the perpetually listening, a lattice of rusted steel rising 5 stories into a scrim of low cloud. Guy wires disappeared into the trees, taut and humming, so faint I felt them in my teeth. To the west, a chain-link gate stood open, half swallowed by ferns. The air was bottom-of-the-lake cold. Inside, the outpost smelled like wool and old coffee, and that sweet sour of mouse nests you never find, only scents. A corkboard map took up most of the common room wall. Paper layered on paper, roads inked and re-inked, red yarn slung from thumbtacks in a web of obviously once important connections. 2 bunks, a pine table, a window over the sink, a battery lantern on a hook. When I flicked the light switch, the room hesitated, and then came up in a color that was less yellow than tired. The fridge made a sound like it was trying to remember a song. I set up my little world. Laptop, interface, headphones, notebooks with their underlines of color-coded anxiety. I brewed coffee whose bitterness I could map with my tongue and opened the station logbook, more out of nosiness than anything else. The last entry, written in square, neat handwriting. Aug 8th, Marta R., 1710. Long night, heard tapping in the stairwell again, probably the tower expanding. No sign of the campers reported near Greywater. If anyone stops in for pamphlets, tell them to use the East Trail and keep kids out of the slash. Saw a tall man at the fence. Might have been a dead tree or my eyesight going. 2120, radio cut mid-sentence. Log static. Tall man. I smiled despite myself. Every ranger outpost has one. Not a man necessarily, but a shared set of anticipations that populate empty spaces. The lighthouse keepers had the lamp trimmer who walked even after the light went electric. The park offices had the woman in the long skirt who kept asking if the hunting permit office closed at 4. Here the tall man had a question mark after him, like a shrug built into 2 words. Dusk came on, as if someone had turned the world down by increments. In the first hour, a truck somewhere far off. In the second, rain gusting and then thinning like static. In the third, a sound like a person softly clearing their throat outside the porch screen, and nothing there when I looked. I settled in with the headphones, scrubbing through files of subways and fountains, church bells and crosswalk chirps, their waveforms stacked like a cardiologist's nightmares. The only thing I recorded that evening was the fire tower humming. I went outside with the parabola mic, held it to the sky, and slowly rotated. The guy wires sang 3 pure notes, far enough apart you could nestle a bass line underneath if you had delusions about making a track out of it. When the wind dropped, the hum didn't quite stop. It persisted like a vibration in bone. Night at Ward 11 felt less like something the sun had vacated and more like something else had leaned in to take over. The windows were black panes where my own reflection hesitated and then moved a fraction too late, like a friend pretending they weren't planning to scare me. I put the lantern on low and read until the words turned to insect legs. I dreamt in patches. The sound of footfalls, then a white shirt collar in the trees, then my hand on the porch rail, splinters biting in as if the wood wanted me to hold on. In the last dream, the map from the wall had fallen and pinned me like a thin, papery gravestone. When I woke at 4, I had a nosebleed. The taste of metal surprised me, and for a minute I sat on the edge of the bunk with my head tipped forward, watching old blood paint new mouth cuts in the sink. The fridge clicked. The guy wires bit on silence. The second morning I walked the perimeter, the kind of walk you do just to say you've done it. The grass along the chain link was beaded with dew, so fat it magnified each blade's cathedrals of green. In places, the forest pressed up against the fence like a poorly thrown blanket bunching at the edges. You could smell the iron in the soil, the damp of moss and the resin sour of broken needles. I stood at the gate and looked at the tower. Up close, the rust was magnificent, like continents, like old maps of places the sea had taken back. The stairs lifted inside on a spiral of steel grating. Halfway up, I had what I can only call a superstitious thought, that if I climbed, the tower would remember what it was for, and lookouts would return to the little platform, and smoke would rise somewhere in a thin gray prayer. I put a foot on the first step, and the hum went through the sole of my boot like a threat. Back inside, I found a box of Polaroids in a drawer under the map. Not much to them. Candid shots of school groups holding laminated trail guides, patrol trucks with the Ward 11 placard crooked in their dash, a flock of turkeys caught mid-run, bodies pivoting like dropped coats. In 4 different photos, taken months apart, a long, out-of-focus stretch of vertical whiteness appeared in the background between trees. It could have been a birch. It could have been a sleeve. I don't know why I flipped the photos over, but the backs were worse. In pencil, hard enough to indent, "Don't look" on 2 of them. On a third, "He picks at edges." I told myself I was playing along with the previous shift's sense of humor, the way you humor the wind when it knocks twice in a house you just learned to love. I put the photos back. I made more coffee. I turned on the radio set in the corner the way you touch a forehead to check for fever. At first, the station squawked and then went to a popcorn of static, the kind you can hear as white or as full depending on your mood. I dialed through. A gardener's call-in somewhere south, a weather report that mentioned thunderstorms with the kind of regret reserved for canceled holidays. 2 men laughing. And then, on dead air, a breath. I know how that sounds. It wasn't a gust and it wasn't a line pop. It was a breath with shape and intent, the kind you take when you're going to speak and then never do. "Ward 11 to 9, I said before I realized I'd done it. "Ward 11 to 9, do you copy?" The radio clicked like an old tongue. Something leaned into the silence from the other end, and then, as if ashamed of itself, leaned away. I turned the radio off. I tried not to look at the map, because the map was starting to look at me. In the underlayer, where some previous person had tried to peel tape and left skin behind, faint arcs of pencil suggested shapes. The red yarn clung to the tacks in a pattern that, if you unfocused, almost made sense. Long verticals joined by short horizontals, a suggestion of limbs and joints in a posture more spider than man. A joke, I thought. A private joke. Don't look. By noon the rain returned, thin enough to seem like a rumor on skin, a whisper that made the tower sing with a new frequency I couldn't place. I moved my work to the porch table and chopped the recordings, that mechanical comfort of cutting silence between sounds, to make new silence. It was only after 10 minutes that I realized the background noise wasn't the rain, not entirely. There was something underneath, a faint pulsing pace, as if a tap had been opened miles away, and each plunk of drip became a step when it reached the gutters of Ward 11. I took off the headphones, and the pulsing continued, because of course it did. You win nothing by taking headphones off. The pulsing wasn't outside, it was in the wood, the kind of building-born noise you get when something big moves somewhere in the frame. I put my palm on the porch railing, and the wood's vibration ran up my arm into an old muscle memory of childhood fevers. Step, pause, step, pause. Longer, step, closer. Then nothing. When you live alone long enough, you grow a second set of eyes not in the back of your head but in your skin, always looking for the shift where you are. I felt the shift happen like a tide, and every hair on my arm tried to stand with its own pair of legs. The rain lifted. The forest went too quiet. Even the guy wires forgot their notes. The silence held like a breath I wished had never been taken. Movement at the tree line is a crude phrase for what I think I saw. It was negative space moving. a tall absence sliding between darker trunks, so that the shape was only visible by what it replaced. I told myself it was the white trunk I'd been noticing in the photos, even while separate parts of my brain shrugged and whispered, "No, you idiot, no bark cracks on that, no knots, no crown." "Hey," I said, because I am a person who says hey to cats and lampposts and men in suits who pretend a corridor is theirs. The shape stopped. For a long moment it did nothing at all, and doing nothing is a kind of answer. "I'm a volunteer," I added, which was true in the way most facts are true if you smear your thumb across them. I picked up the parabolic mic and propped it on the rail as if it could defend me. My voice sounded like it had been kept in a closet too long. Something in the trees tilted, and I knew then it was a head where no face was. The reasonable part of me clicked on with blessed clinical relief. Of course, Slender Man, the internet's faceless boogeyman, lanky and suited, the modern folklore thing kids dared each other about and bored office workers wrote articles on. A meme, a story you only make real by telling. All a false recognition, a matrix of expectation, authors note at end. The shape slid another step and then vanished by the oldest method. I blinked, and the gap between trees had no gap at all. I stayed on the porch so long, my coffee cooled in incremental rudeness, and a numbness took my thigh as if a cat had fallen asleep there and refused to be moved. Only there was no cat. At some point, the tower hummed again, a little deeper now, a baritone throat clearing like the kind before an apology. When the rain started back up, simple and honest, I let out a breath that ended with a flinch I didn't understand was grief until later. Inside, I found something new. The Polaroids had moved. Not far, just skewed, as if someone had jostled the drawer and they'd slid. Neighboring things in drawers do that. It is the entire work of drawers to let things move. But the top photo was a portrait of the fire tower taken from the porch, and in the bottom left corner of that photo, a sleeve, black. Sharp-edged, as a suit jacket is sharp because suits are machines for pretending we are sharper than we are. It is a small thing to learn that your humor can't save you. I said out loud again, "Okay." I am embarrassed now by the repetition of that word, its anemic courage. Okay, okay. The light went strange. Not dark. This wasn't a storm, but thin, like the switch had been thrown that turns moments to memory. A pressure changed in the room. It popped in my ears. I lifted my phone and took a single picture of the map to send to a friend with the caption, "The Rangers are weird wherever you go," an intimacy I hoped would turn the day ordinary again. The photo wouldn't save. The app froze with a pale smear of white in the center, as if something in the exact middle of the lens had pulled all color out and kept it. The phone made a noise like a whispered vowel. Then it simply went black, a phone asleep without dreaming. Behind me, the fridge sighed as if to say, yes, that too. The next hour is difficult to stack in order because events were less like dominoes and more like the indistinct shudder of a train seen from the wrong side of a fence. I know I checked the doors. The key stuttered in the locks, and then decided to work like a moody animal deciding to sit. I know I went upstairs to the little mezzanine loft and found a second logbook pushed between mattress and wall, spiral-bound and private. Do not log. This was written on the cover in angry block letters. I know I started to read. He's different every time. Someone had written in pencil the way you write hope on paper when hope needs a roof and a door. Not face different. Intention different. Sometimes he just stands there like a bad drawing you can't crumple. Sometimes he takes steps you can hear in the tower. Sometimes it's in the radio, the breath, the don't. Flipped pages, same hand. M. Says he's a mimetic hazard. He likes it when you tell it. He likes it when you listen to recordings of him. He likes film. The tall man loves a lens. There was a coffee ring right through lens, a circular stain like an eclipse that had stopped halfway and decided we were nice enough to spare. I wanted to laugh. It came out like a cough, and then something warm ran from my nose into my mouth. I wiped blood on my sleeve like a child. Slender sickness, my brain supplied helpfully, like a wiki. Nosebleeds, headaches, paranoia. I have never disliked my brain more than at that moment, when it decided to be a librarian quoting to me while the building stood with its head bent as if listening at the door. You set a microphone in a room long enough and everything learns to perform. The radio crackled, a small sound that makes your shoulders get older. The tower's hum rose half a step, a modulation you feel in knees more than ears. Outside, branches didn't move, but the space between them did. I picked up a roll of gaffer tape and began to cover lenses. Laptop webcam, phone camera, the lens of the GoPro I brought because I like keeping a visual memory of places as a handhold when I'm home. You don't realize how many eyes a room has until you start closing them. I cut the power next, because panic has always worn the overalls of a plan. Generator off, solar cut off, a switch near the back door as self-respecting as any other. The fridge objected in its language of clicking and then grew philosophical and stopped. The silence that followed was pure, except for the tower, which kept its note like a monk alone in a bell tower practicing for a mass no one had requested. I packed. I decided that leaving at once was sensible and adult and something I could live with because I would still be the kind of person who saw a thing and didn't stay to make it show me all its coats. The hallway to the front door had grown longer. I cannot explain this kindly. It had added an extra plank of floor, the way your thoughts add a whole day sometimes between Tuesday and Wednesday, a sly 24 hours with nothing to recommend it but the feel of its own tongue. I walked the hallway and the porch door was an inch farther away than I remembered. A little joke, I thought, jacketed in a feeling not unlike grief again. I opened the door. The world outside had been rearranged just enough to make me an accessory to its new shape. The trees a little taller, the path a little narrower, the gate still open but somehow heavier, as if a hand held it from the other side and would make me ask twice if I wanted it back. He stood beyond the gate. I will not dress the word. He was tall in a way that defied measurements like meters might do to someone who had never met a meter in the wild. His suit fit as if it had been drawn on. Where the face should have been was a white that made my eyes water. Not bright, not luminous, but white, like you look at a blank page too long and see after images of stories that weren't written there. Out from his shoulder blades or his spine, words are insufficient for the places he issued from. Long, dark articulations emerged, not exactly tentacles and not exactly arms, but the suggestion of both and the honesty of neither. They swayed slightly, like guy wires in a wind you couldn't feel. He tilted at me, not a nod, not a bow, something else polite and predatory in equal parts. The forest rearranged around him to make him make more sense. Do not look, the pencil on the Polaroids had suggested, as if I had a choice. Looking is the first job we give to our hands when we're born. Are you anything? I asked very softly because I have this defect of language. Or only a picture of yourself? His head turned without moving. Of all the impossibilities, that was the most petty and the most convincing. Later, when I try to account for what happened next in words I can admit to owning, I find I have to choose which angle to lie from. What feels most accurate is this. The distance between us began to fail. Not the ground closing, not him stepping, those I could inventory, but the very quality of space losing its ability to be counted. Step, and he was a meter nearer. Blink, and he was 2. Look down, and the fabric at his cuffs was so close I could see a thread working itself to freedom. His appendages, limbs, cables, stretched and folded and were not where they had been the second before. They reminded me of hoses on a fire truck, that thick, deceptive slack, and then suddenly pressure and all the air in the world forced through. I backed into the porch. I closed the door, because doors are the one spell we always have. Wood met frame with an obedience I took as a blessing. He did not knock. He did not rattle the handle. Instead, the house itself adjusted, as if accommodating a guest in a hallway who took up too much space. Perhaps he prefers to be invited, I thought, because I am a person who tries to flatter monsters into better behavior. I sat with my back to the door and felt the wood lean. The radio, woken from its lifelessness, spoke once, and what it said was not a word, but it made my mind want to kneel. Not don't, not come. Something like now. There are many ways to surrender. I picked the one I knew. I went to the map. I pulled at the red yarn with both hands and made it a ruin. Thumbtacks popped, these tiny gunshots of ridiculous victory. Beneath the map, the wall was layered with old pencil, as I'd suspected, lines and arcs and coordinates. A shape with its central vertical lines repeating, faint and exact, long jointed, extra. Someone had been making a sketch underneath the topography of Ward 11, a sketch that would have made sense if you knew which limb to call it. Down in the bottom right corner, if you erase him, he redraws himself in the negative space. My skin did that tightening that wants to be running. I tore at the paper, hands stinging with push pins, and revealed nothing new, only older versions of the same. In the last layer, a photograph had been taped, small, glossy, printed off a bad home printer at an angle. A birthday party in a city apartment, 5 years ago maybe, a window reflecting, a figure outside just at the top of the frame, too tall for the balcony, head just visible over the railing like a moon. The person cutting the cake was me. That was the moment things lined up in a way worse than tidy. That was the moment the new idea stepped down into the old footprints. I remembered. A party I didn't want to be at. Late June heat. The balcony door cracked for air. A flash on my own phone that came back with a glare so complete I tossed the photo and laughed. I remembered the episode I'd pitched for my audio channel, urban legends we told to fill the holes we dug ourselves, and the little pre-roll I cut for it, the teaser with the tower hum behind the voiceover, the upright piano chord I bent digital to give a scrape of grief. I remembered the emails after. Hey, I have a story about a guy with no face who stood at the edge of our soccer field. Hey, my daughter drew this at daycare. Hey, my brother works search and rescue, and once he heard a voice in the trees that told him not to turn around. I had laughed, because laughter is a small lock when you don't know which door is the right one to close. He likes it when you tell it. The unsanctioned logbook had said in its pencil that looked like a dirty fingernail. He likes film. He likes lenses. He likes the shape of attention. Okay, I said again, and if it was prayer, then prayer is mostly repeating the words you have until they sound like new words or old words wearing better shoes. I lit the stove. Paper goes bright in a way that makes you think all ideas might be this easy to be rid of. The map took like a thirsty thing. Curl, char, sudden softness where there had been assertion. Smoke climbed and huddled at the rafters with a smell like roasted newsprint and disappointed librarians. Outside the windows, the space between trees flashed pale, as if something without face had held up its hands against sudden light. The tower's note lifted, then lowered, as if something enormous had considered standing and then sat back down. I fed the paper in the Polaroids, and then, because I am not above dramatic gestures when terrified, I fed the hard drives. They cracked like sugar burnt too far. The stove glowed into its inner bones. I turned from the orange mouth, and in the window above the sink was a smear of white the exact size of a head pressed to glass. Only the glass was 3 meters away, and the head was inside, or else distance had grown bored with itself again. The white pulsed, not light, not heat, like an absence working a muscle. Please, I said, because there's a point at which politeness merges with charm, and both of them are weapons you hope you're strong enough to lift. I'm done telling it. The radio, which I had not turned back on, crackled to life, and then died again. The tower made a brief new chord and then remembered itself. In the silence, something moved in the stairwell with deliberate care, a hand sliding along a rail not for balance but to savor the rail. I grabbed the flare. There was one in the emergency kit, a small cylinder of promised color. On the porch, under the roof with the rain slanting straight like lines on a lined page, I cracked it and flames sprang up the way a desperate idea does. The flare filled the porch with a hissing red that tasted like salt and electricity. For a moment, only a moment, the white at the window withdrew. The guy wires took up the new note and sang it back shrill. You have my attention, I said to the place the tall man had been, and then to all the places he might be. You can keep it. You only get mine. If I say he recoiled, I make him smaller than he was. He altered. The space at the gate gained depth again. The trees forgave their straightness. The limbs, that wrong geometry behind his shoulders, tightened as if bracing. He didn't fear fire. He feared that I had found a way to crown myself in a story that wasn't his. The flare seethed and began to gutter. We cannot hold a crown above our heads forever. The flare died with a hiss that felt like a friend leaving a party without goodbyes. The rain ratcheted up, gleeful, childish in its suddenness. The tower hummed a note I didn't recognize and then found its old one like a singer who's cracked and is pretending not to. I did the last thing I could do that wasn't screaming. I wrote this. Not because I hope to warn you, warnings are just stories in reflective vests, nor because confession protects anyone. I wrote because there is a chance he starves on specificity. He lives on the versions of himself told by people who never met him. He fattens on the general shape, the meme smooth silhouette, the repeating beats cheap enough to memorize. This is not that. This is a thing with particulars. The coffee ring on the logbook, the way the porch vibrated exactly 4 times before it grew quiet, the red yarn's tooth marks in soft pine, the way a white knot light made my eyes itch. It is possible I am wrong. It is possible I am feeding him the finest meal he has ever eaten by setting the table this way with fault lines and room temperature and fibers and smoke. It is possible what he loves is not the telling, but the reader. If you have read this far, do something ordinary now. Fill a glass with water and drink it. Drop a spoon. Say I am here aloud to your empty room. Make a shape with your hands nobody else will recognize. Do not go looking at the corners of the window. Do not try to hear a hum that may or may not be there. The last thing we give anyone is attention. I have given enough for both of us, and I am empty, and he is full, which is not a metaphor and not a moral, but a report from a room where rain is handwriting, and the tower holds a note like a throat remembers a song. It is morning now. Light comes skinned in silver. The map wall is bare except for the holes the pins kissed. The radio is a lump. The Polaroids are ash. On the inside of the porch door at eye level, a streak of white chalk that I did not put there. A vertical line, long, with 4 shorter lines off its left and right like ribs or ladder rungs. A child could have drawn it. I don't know if a child did. I will wait until the rain thins to a suggestion of rain, and then I will go. If the hallway is longer, I will walk more hallway. If the gate is heavier, I will lean my shoulder. If the tower sings, I will let it be its own throat. If he is waiting at the edge of the trees, I will keep the ordinary to myself and give him none of it. And if he follows me home, I will write nothing but grocery lists and the names of roads and the dates of the week on envelopes I will mail to nobody. I will speak to the plants and tell them to drink. I will call my friend and then another friend and say, "Hey, I was just thinking of you." There is a footprint on the porch that is not a footprint, only an absence in the pine dirt where water would have darkened it, as if something preferred dry feet and didn't care whose porch it wore to get them. I am not as afraid as I should be. This is a different mistake than the ones I have been making, and so it feels, for a moment, like wisdom. Outside at the tree line, an extra vertical appears, then vanishes when I name the birches. The hum in the guy wires becomes 3 notes again. I count them like beads. I count them like stairs. I open the door. If the world is taller than it was 2 days ago, then I will have to grow into it. And if I cannot, then let me at least keep from giving it the measurements it wants. Let me say nothing that becomes food. Let me be a door that closes and stays closed without a story to prop it. This is my last sentence, and the last attention I will spend on a shape without a face and a hunger for it. I'm done telling it. I didn't plan on spending the night. The sky made that decision for me. By the time the last turn bled me off Highway 101 toward the Bluff Road, the Pacific had swallowed the sun whole. Fog muscled in from the water, thick and low, dragging the world into a smudged charcoal drawing. My wipers pushed at the mist like an old broom through cobwebs. The radio had long since turned to static, an ugly hiss that rose and fell as the road climbed and dipped. The cabin belonged to my friend's cousin, a cozy ocean hideout, she'd called it, with great Wi-Fi. I needed quiet. I needed a new beginning. After the mess I'd slunk away from in the city, boxes taped haphazardly, a key left in a dish, an open wound of a conversation I wouldn't let scab over yet, the idea of being somewhere no one knew me sounded like gauze pressed over a cut. As I rolled over the last hill, my headlights revealed a wood sign slouching like a drunk. First Aid Station, EST 1937. Someone had painted Beach House over it, in white that already peeled. I laughed once under my breath. Great. The cabin hunched at the edge of the cliff like a patient refusing to meet the doctor's eye. It was a long rectangle of gray shingles and glass, the porch bitten by salt and wind. Beyond it, the ocean flexed and slammed itself against black rock. A foghorn muttered from somewhere to the south, long, patient moans that threaded into the wind. When I cut the engine, another sound rose, a wet stone hush as if 1,000 whispered apologies were washing back and forth down in the churning dark. I left the radio on a second longer just to fill the silence with something I could name. Then I grabbed my backpack, stepped into the night, and the smell hit me. Salt, kelp, and underneath, iodine. Clean and clinical, a scent I only knew from one other place, the little clinic where my father had his stitches removed when I was 10. I remembered how he held still, jaw clamped, while the nurse snipped and tugged, and he said afterward, "Simple. Hold still long enough and they take the thread out. All you need is time." I told myself the tide was dragging up bottles of antiseptic from some ship that spilled a decade ago. The mind will invent reasonable stories for unreasonable smells. Inside, the cabin was bigger than it looked. One wide room with a low-beamed ceiling, windows facing the water, a couch, a table, a pot-bellied stove rusted to umber. On the far wall, someone had hung old first aid posters, faded diagrams of how to splint a leg, how to treat shock, how to wrap a head wound. They looked like ghosts of instructions, pale hands demonstrating on blank-faced models. I found the light switch. The bulbs hummed on like insects. The floorboards sighed. The air was cooler than I expected, as if the room held its breath while I flicked the switch, then exhaled reluctantly. The key had come tucked in a padded envelope with a note written in neat loops. "Stove's tricky. Turn until you hear the click and count to 5. Wi-Fi password is under the bowl. Don't mind the cedar smell." I held the paper up to my face. It didn't smell like cedar. It smelled like something scrubbed too hard. Under the bowl was a scrawl of letters and numbers, and a photograph folded twice. The building in the 1950s, when it was still a first aid station. A small line of people at the door. Fishermen in caps, a kid with a sling, a woman with a bandage around her head and her eyes closed like she was dreaming standing up. I made tea. The kettle took its time, complaining faintly as it heated. I texted my friend a picture of the fog through the window. She sent back a row of wave emojis and, after a delay, "Careful out there, Bandage Man country. Lol." I stared at her message, thumb hovering over the keyboard. I'd heard the name thrown around once. Late-night radio, spooky listicles. The thing wrapped in gauze that jumps into the beds of trucks, stinks of rot, pounds on windows, trailing dirty bandages that end up in your car. A hitchhiker that doesn't walk, instead it gathers. "Very funny," I wrote back. She didn't respond. The tea tasted metallic, too hot in my throat. The first noise came while I was unrolling my sleeping bag. It was small, thoughtless, a papery rustle near the window. I looked up. The fog had pushed against the glass until the view was an arm's length of gray. A moth, I thought, and went back to coaxing the zipper open. But the sound came again, a little longer, like paper dragged slowly over wood. I crossed to the window and put my palm to it. The glass was cold enough to shock the nerves in my hand. Through the film of fog pressed close, something pale blotted and slid. I flinched back. "It's a leaf. Calm down." I tried the stove the way the note said. The click was like a soft knuckle against bone. Flame bloomed blue, then steadied into orange. Heat licked my shins through my jeans, and the cabin shed one layer of chill. The foghorn sounded again, closer, as if it were inside the room and the walls had swallowed it and let it go. That's the thing about being alone. You start to believe the house is breathing. You start to map a rhythm between its size and your own. I set my bag near the couch and opened the little cupboard by the door to find an extra blanket. Inside, the shelves were tidy with supplies in metal tins, scissors, tweezers, tape, rolls of gauze, a field kit's worth of old first aid stuff. My hand brushed a roll of bandage and it crackled, sticking slightly, as if the adhesive had melted and reformed a dozen times with the changes in weather. A line of words ran along the shelf in pencil, the faintest of inscriptions, likely written decades ago. Everything wants to be held together. I let the lid close a fraction too hard. The sound ricocheted into the room's quiet. "All right," I said out loud, ridiculous and necessary, "so there's gauze." I slept poorly, which is to say I pretended well. The stove dimmed, the fog pressed harder. Sometime after the kettle had cooled to a small, thin ring of light on the stovetop, I must have slipped down into a shallow pool of sleep, and then, with no transition, was awake again, listening as carefully as I could. A soft weight had settled in the room. I didn't know what else to call it. My heart went to staccato, little bits of music in it where there were none before. The papery sound returned, but closer this time. It came from the crack at the bottom of the door, a dry whisper like a finger dragged through sieved sand. The foghorn called. The thing paused when it sounded, then resumed, as if it had a rhythm to keep. I watched the crack, irrationally sure that something would slide under. A few moments later, something did. A strip of white, thin as ribbon, curling on itself, inching forward with a movement that wasn't a movement but a series of subtle shifts, as a snake moves, as a wound closes. I snapped on the porch light. The strip stopped. In its length, rust-brown stains. I registered the smell at the same time, and the smell obliterated the rest of the room, the tea, the stove, the damp, leaving only itself, iodine and rot braided together until they were inseparable, the antiseptic and the sickness it failed to control. The smell of a clinic's drawer left closed too long on a wet day. I didn't realize I'd stepped toward the door until my bare toes touched the strip. It clung coldly, a breath on my skin, its edge coiled. I recoiled like I'd put my foot on a slug. I grabbed the corner of the bandage between finger and thumb and tugged. It gave a little, then caught. Something on the other side of the door held it. Something with weight. A knock, then. Not from a fist, no, that would have been better. It was a flat sound, broad, as if a pillow had been smacked against wood. Then another, a rhythm. 3, 2, 3, pause, 3 again. It took me one stupid cycle to realize what the rhythm mimicked, the foghorn's moan. I eased the latch and opened the door a hair. The fog came in like breath. Something pale reared in it, a stacked, irregular height like a person's shape made by someone who had only been told what a person should look like. Layers upon layers of cloth or paper or skin wound around an absent core. The porch light made no shadow behind it. It was shadow, sort of, an interruption of the gray that still moved with the wind. My mouth said quietly, no. It took one soundless step. The top of it tilted, a head's angle. It didn't have a face. It didn't need one. Everything about it was a single hungry gesture. The lines of it all slanted toward me. I slammed the door. The catch protested but held. The strips under the door flailed, then were yanked back so quickly they burned a line on my toe. The smell surged. My stomach flipped like a coin and landed on its edge. I fed the stove. The bandage strips did not return. The foghorn sounded another letter of its long message to nobody living. I sat on the couch and watched the slice of dark under the door for a long time, while the stove heat worked its way into my bones. When sleep came again, it was a hook dragged along the bottom of me. The morning peeled back the fog, as if the sky were tired of the bit. Sunlight arrived in lines through the window panes, startlingly clean. The ocean looked like hammered steel, 1,000 small dents catching light. My toe had a line of heat-stung skin where the bandage had kissed it. When I moved, the line burned. I cleaned it with soap and water and laughed at myself for wanting to look for alcohol, as if I would fix the smell by matching it. Outside on the porch, a scatter of gauze scraps lay curled like shed snakeskin, all of them stained and stiff. They made the most ordinary sound in the world when I kicked them, a dry skitter. The smell was less, but still there, a note you couldn't unhear. I should have gotten in the car and left. The thought came and went without finding purchase. The ocean did that thing where it made me feel the size of my heart and no larger. The wind came more gently. I told myself that the thing I'd seen was a trick of fog and nerves. That was the story I wrapped over my fear. The mind has gauze for every wound, and if the wound is big enough, the mind uses the whole roll. I walked the path that ran along the cliff's edge. It was nothing more than flattened grass where other feet had gone before, a ribbon of lighter green threading along the darker. Every few yards, the ground opened in a crease where water had cut a scar into the earth. I found gull feathers tangled with gray silk that wasn't fabric, not quite, a mat of something that could have been algae if it weren't too white. I found that if I tugged, it held. I found that if I tugged harder, it released itself with a soft sound and came away in a long, damp strip. It clung to my fingers. For a second, my body thought, web, and for a second on top of that, skin. I flung it into the wind. It plastered itself to the grass instead and lay there as if it were waiting patiently to be useful. I climbed down to the black rocks where the waves shattered. Seals lay on their backs 100 yards out, like a handful of stones had rolled and found they were tired. The world, the vast, indifferent world, didn't seem to care about last night. But when I moved to step across a gap in the rocks, something white tightened around my boot. I looked down. A ribbon had wet itself over my laces while I'd been staring at the seals. It had already made one turn around my ankle. I caught the end of it and pulled, and it resisted, actively, like it had fingers I couldn't see. "No," I said again, that small, useless word. I yanked hard. It gave with a sound like the inside of my cheek when I peel my tongue off it. I flung the strip away. It stuck to a different rock, then began to lift, as if a wind moved under it and not over it. My chest buzzed. I didn't want to explore anymore. I hiked back to the cabin, each footfall measured, as if the bandage could think like a rattlesnake and would strike if I ran. The second night, I left the porch light on. I'd rather see the thing that kills me than let it feel surprise. Around midnight, the power went. It didn't stutter. It simply ended. The stove blinked. The room pressed in. The ocean came louder, as if distance had been a feature of electricity. My reflection in the window was an outline and a doubt. The generator, I remembered belatedly. The note had mentioned it, casual as a recipe instruction. Shed out back, diesel. Pull the rope 3 times. The night bullied the porch when I opened the door. The light from my phone forged a bobbing tunnel through it. The grass was cold on my ankles. Something touched my calf, a brush that could have been plant or animal or wind, which is to say it could have been anything, and therefore was everything. The shed leaned into the hill. Its latch rusted the color of dried blood. I clicked it open and let the door sigh. The smell inside was old fuel, and under it that other smell, thinner but present, like a memory of a hospital waiting room. It had followed me, or it had never left. The generator squatted like a dog that expected to be hit. The rope was greasy. I wrapped my fingers around it and pulled. It jerked back, a temper tantrum. Second pull, a cough. Third, it almost caught. And then, while I was preparing to try again, a hand closed coldly around my wrist. No fingers, not a hand. Pressure. A strip pulled tight as if knotted to the generator's handle. It yanked. My phone clattered to the concrete. The light spun and died. Darkness filled with breath, the heavy kind that comes when you are doing what you love or what you hate. "Let go," I said, as if the night spoke English. A whisper answered, not sound exactly, but shaped like one, made of friction and fabric. "Wrap." I tore at my own wrist, and my nails dug a line that would be a bruise in the morning. The pressure intensified. Another loop slid up my forearm, then another around my elbow. With each touch, the smell rose. I thought of that old pencil line in the cupboard. Everything wants to be held together. And the thought came with a flash behind my eyes, like lightning filmed at 1,000 frames per second. This thing, this mass, this patient assembly of strips and tattered cloth had learned an old lesson too well and could not stop trying to apply it. It believed there was nothing that couldn't be solved by adding another layer. It believed you were safer that way. It wanted me to be safe. I fumbled for the generator's cap. My fingers found the knurling by luck. I unscrewed it, and gasoline smell slapped the room. The pressure on my arm faltered minutely, surprised. I tipped the can stored next to it and sloshed fuel over my sleeve, my wrist, the band. The band was not dumb. It tried to retreat. It could not retreat fast enough. I had matches. I had bought them at a gas station weeks ago because the cashier had a jar labeled for a good cause, and I had cash. My body remembered this because some part of me believed in good causes. I struck a match on the wall. The sulfuric flare answered like a small, pleased animal leaping to my hand. I touched the flame to my soaked sleeve. It took with a sound like 1,000 whispered apologies catching fire. Pain made the night simple. The bandage buckled back, then blackened, then flashed with quick orange that ate along it. I smothered my sleeve under the generator's tarp, and the pain reset from a shout to a steady hiss in my nervous system. When the strip on my arm burned, it didn't smell only like diesel. It smelled like hair. It smelled like my father's stitches after the nurse had cut the last thread and placed them in a paper cup, and he had, God help him, set the cup on the dash of the car to show me what had once held him together, and we had forgotten it there. And a week later the car had that smell, and my mother had said carefully, "Please throw that away." I kicked at the blackening thing on the floor. It slapped wetly against the concrete and then fled in a way that had no legs but borrowed the idea of legs from the moving things it had studied. The generator took on the next pull, as if the night had never been here. Back in the cabin, I practiced breathing with the stove, slow as a wave strikes and withdraws. I poured cool water over my red skin and held my arm over the sink. It wanted to throb strictly, to keep time with a drum that I didn't hear anymore. Somewhere in the pipes, something knocked 3 times, then twice, then 3 again. The radio I'd left off clicked on by itself. Static bled from it, then an intermittent chattering. At first I thought it was a weather warning. Then I tilted my head and heard numbers, not numbers, codes. I had worked at a coffee shop near a firehouse once. I had learned the shape of emergency radio talk, the quickness, the fit of the words around urgency like muscle around bone, laceration, possible fracture, unresponsive, uncontrolled bleeding. The static flared. Beneath it, a voice whispered, not electronic, not human exactly, but shaped like both by the channel it had stolen. Wrap keep you together, hold you safe, hold you quiet, hold you still, hold, hold, hold. I threw a dish towel over the radio. The voice went on from inside the cloth, as if the towel were the perfect medium. I pulled the plug. The voice softened. The bandage wanted to make a better connection, a more efficient coverage. The second instinct came less like a thought and more like a scar itching in rain. I took the folded photograph from the drawer. On the back, in pencil, someone had written names: Dr. Owens, Joan, Robert, under the line of faces. At the bottom, the smallest girl with the head bandage had no name. Next to her, in a different hand, one that crushed the pencil harder, someone had drawn a small square, and inside it, a short symbol made of 3 lines that almost looked like an E, and almost looked like the 2 teeth of a staple. I turned the picture over and held it up to the lamp. The foghorn called its long note, and the line of people looked toward it, eyes barely dark shadows. The little girl's bandage was wrapped nicely, neat crossing turns above her ear. The strip tucked under itself perfectly. A well-taught hand had done it. I stared at it until the picture's grain dissolved and I saw the porch. I saw in my memory and then vividly in my mind's eye what I hadn't allowed myself to notice. In the line of gauze strips last night, in the little pile of bandage scraps on the porch this morning. Not random, not a mess, a pattern. The same slanted turns repeated, an echo of neatness that a sloppy thing tried to mimic obsessively. It had learned how to wrap a head there, on that porch, from a woman whose hands had done it hundreds of times. It had learned that if you held someone carefully enough, the bleeding would stop. It wasn't a ghost of a man at all. It was a habit. A mistake that had gained mass until it could stand up. The Bandage Man was not a person, but an answer that refused to admit it didn't fit the question. What, then, did it want from me? My arm stung. My toe pulsed. Something inside my chest whispered back to the radio voice, unbidden. Hold me. Quiet me. End the mess. I shut the thought down so hard it echoed. The rest of the night I waited with the stove. The bandage did not come under the door again. It sought the vents instead. It came as a soft filter on the window screens. It pressed a delicate layer over the keyhole, a membrane that bulged when I blew on it and held. At dawn, I slept briefly without knowing it, head on the table, arm outstretched like a patient offering veins. I woke to the weight in the passenger seat. The cabin had moved closer to the car between one breath and the next. That's the only way I can describe it. I was at the table, and then I was at the wheel. Engine already on. Hands already white. I haven't decided if I dreamed starting the car and made it happen, or if I started the car and dreamed it. Either way, the feeling in the passenger seat was ancient and immediate. The sense that a large person sat beside me in absolute silence. The air around them complicated. The smell sudden as a word you'd forgotten and now had to live with. I refused to look. The road unspooled under me in its precise brown. The fog folded up behind the car and down ahead of it. The windshield wipers drew a metronome of attention. I drove because my father had once said, "Hold still long enough and they take the thread out." And because I had learned, since then, that movement is also a way to lie to pain. The weight shifted, a slow lean forward, a patient reach. Something brushed my shoulder. The seatbelt creaked, and in the sound was the future, metal that would give too late. "Don't," I said. and the word came out with a tremor that made it godless. I focused on the road. A sign whipped by, Cannon Beach 5. Another. The Bandage Man country remark had been a joke. It scraped now, not funny at all. The glove box clicked open. Of course. The car's small mouth. The bandage liked mouths. It liked openings. It liked covering them more. A roll tipped out, the emergency gauze kit I kept for the sake of feeling prepared. The roll unraveled as if it had been waiting to be asked. Something cold wrapped my forearm, the unburned one. The tightness was not vicious. It was careful, the way the bandage had learned. A turn, a tuck, a pressure that whispered to the skin, "You are contained, you can stop trying now." I peeled the strip off with my teeth and spat it to the floor. It coiled like a white snake. The roll kept coming as if the glove box had no end inside it. The weight in the seat leaned again. The smell filled the car, and when I breathed it, some part of me calmed so comprehensively I panicked harder, because calm that arrives like that is never a gift. A break in the trees gave me the ocean's edge and a turnout. I swung onto the gravel and let the car shudder to a stop near a huge, broken stump. The fog thinned just enough that I could see the drop, the glitter of water in a brittle north light. I reached under the seat where, because my father had been thorough in teaching me how to avoid new stitches, I'd always kept a bright orange emergency flare. It was long as my forearm and ugly as a weapon. The cap came off too easily. The striker end stared up like a mean eye. The glove box bandage lifted, and the weight beside me gathered. A shape was assembling in the seat now, not only invisible weight. Strips lifted from the seams of the seat, from the floor mats, from the trunk through the fold between the seats. Somewhere, impossibly, a fragment of fabric had found the idea of a nose and arranged itself accordingly. A little indent, a little place where air might be breathed in. It tilted toward me. "Listen," I said. "I'm not the one you want." The flare hissed alive with a chemical roar. I jammed it into the roll still unspooling from the glove box. Fire zipped along the bandage like gossip. It leapt to the other strips. The thing recoiled, all its non-face contorting in a way that could only be felt, not seen. Flame ate without respect. The car filled with black, greasy smoke so fast my eyes leaked and I couldn't tell if I was crying. The passenger seat's fabric puckered and blackened. The weight jerked as if afflicted by a series of small heart attacks. The smell, a whole clinic's worth of wrongness, punched me in waves. I shoved the door and fell out trailing fire. The flare skittered under the car, still bright. I belly scrambled away, hands finding purchase in gravel that adopted all the cruelty of glass. The passenger side vomited a long, choked streamer of burning cloth that made a sound like an animal might make if it were made of laundry. The bandage fled. It did not die wholly. It sprang to the brush and ran through it like wind with a body. It split itself to move faster. It reassembled where the fog gathered thickest and then tore itself again as the flare kissed it. The smell branded the air. Gulls lifted, outraged. The foghorn called and did not alter its tone. By the time I stamped the last rag of fire out with the heel of my boot, the car was a wounded thing. The seat had blistered to a lunar landscape. The glove box hung like a broken jaw. My arm sang its pain clearly, now that the chorus had stopped. I sucked a breath and tasted a cocktail of everything I never wanted in my lungs. I sat on the stump and laughed. The laugh came from a strange place, low and tight. It didn't even sound like me. I covered my mouth with both hands to hold it inside where it couldn't do damage. When I was a child and I fell and skinned my knee on the playground gravel, my father would say, "Breathe through it. Don't make a noise and it won't own you." Then he would wash it, and the wash would hurt. And then he would say, "See, held together." It is a gift and a curse to be taught that everything you feel can be cinched. The rest of the drive into town was a series of little rebukes. The car groaned and rattled, and at stoplights the people on the sidewalk looked toward it and then away, the way people do around emergencies they aren't currently responsible for. The smell refused to leave me. It settled in the small eternities in my nose and in my hair and in the weave of my shirt. I wanted to shower with bleach. I wanted to climb out of my organs and soak them in salt. At a gas station, the cashier's jar still said "for a good cause," but the dollar bills inside had curled toward each other, shy. I bought a bottle of rubbing alcohol and poured it over my arm in the parking lot. A man hosing his motorcycle watched me and then minded his business so vigorously, an observer might have thought he was very bad at minding others and had to practice often. I considered the hospital and pictured being swaddled. Instead, I sat in the car with all the windows open, ocean air drumming through. The passenger seat creaked as if something still shifted its weight there. I forced myself to look. The bandage was gone. But near the buckle, a small torn strip clung like a ribbon tied to mark ownership. It lifted on the wind and then settled again, patient. I reached to rip it off, and my fingers stopped half an inch above it. I didn't want to touch it. I could tell myself this was superstition. I could tell myself it was instinct. The body knows a bad food by sight sometimes, by smell, by the shape of your mother's face at the table when she says, "Maybe not that one." As the sun seemed through cloud and made the world briefly tender, I drove back toward the cabin. I don't know why. The sensible thing was away, to a hotel, to a shower that smelled only of citrus, to a bedspread bleached so hard it had forgotten it had ever been any other color than alive. But the first aid posters, and the photograph, and the pencil words, and the way the strips had learned, I had to see where it slept. If it slept. The cabin met me with its porched stoicism. The window screens were clean. The floor inside bore the faint imprints of my feet, and next to them, not footprints but a drag, a sweep, the way something covers its own tracks because it only knows one motion. I opened the cupboard with the tidy tins. In the neatness was an apology. In the apology, a story. I picked up the roll I'd touched the first night. The adhesive side grabbed my fingers affectionately. Someone had written on the inside of the roll, there, where no one would see unless they unwound the whole thing. "I'm sorry, Joan." The photograph's names. The woman who wrapped a bandage too well, too often, too lovingly. The girl whose head had been smoothed down by strips of gauze until her ear lay flat. The doctor whose signature hung on the wall under a letter of commendation. The child with no name and the tight bandage covering whatever had hurt there. A story like that is the kind that breeds in damp walls, a kindness that became a ritual that performed itself after the hands that started it were gone. "Well," I said to the empty room, which was not empty but contained everything necessary for such a story to keep going. "Now what?" "Now I leave," was the thought. "I take the photograph because it's mine. I take nothing else. I tell the cousin to come get her own ghosts. I say nothing to the town. The town knows. The town has seen the strips snagging on fences and the black smoke now and then on the bluff where someone else learned the same lesson today. There is also the thought I don't voice. I could bring it to someone who needs it, someone who thinks they do, a person left by the person who once said I can hold you together. I could lay the strip across my throat and press. I could feel the comfort of being contained. I could, for once, stop the noise. I took the picture. I locked the door. The porch light listened. On the way out, I drove slow. The fog moved, old animal. The glove box gaped empty. The torn strip near the seatbelt stirred and lay still. I glanced at it again. It looked like nothing, a tiny, grimy ribbon. I hated it. At the first turnout, I stopped and opened the passenger door. The bandage piece shivered as if it were cold and I had exposed it. I pinched it with 2 fingers and pulled. It came reluctantly, like a thought that wants to stay. It tried to adhere to my skin. I shook it free, and it fluttered to the ground where it lay face down, if a strip can have a face. The wind lifted and pressed it against my boot. "No," I said a third time, and because I was done with that small word, I added, "Not me." I got back in and drove, windows open, radio off. The foghorn gave me its last lesson for a while, a mournful syllable that could be anything if you started it wrong. That night, hundreds of miles inland, in a motel where the walls were as thin as lies and the air smelled of citrus and dust, I undressed and showered until my skin could not bear my own hand. The mirror blurred with steam. When I wiped it, the person inside had the expression of someone who has carried a heavy bag too far and forgotten that they could put it down. I slept. A good oblivion for an hour. 2. Then the itch woke me. Not an itch, exactly. A suggestion. I turned on the bedside lamp. The light uncovered something I had not wanted to suspect. On my wrist, where the burned skin branched into unburned, a line of white had appeared. Not a strip, not a thing placed from outside. A seam, under the skin, the shape of a careful wrap, faint as a watermark, and visible only when I flexed my hand and the skin stretched and revealed the pattern briefly before it hid again. The line ran in a familiar crisscross, just like in the photograph. It looked like the memory of a bandage. It looked like a story trying to make a body true. I pressed my fingers to it and felt the smallest resistance, a pressure that pushed back not with strength but with purpose. The radio on the nightstand, which had been unplugged, whispered a word from inside the plastic of its case, as if the casing itself were now the perfect medium. Hold. The bandage does not need to be in the car. It does not need to be in the cabin, in the cupboard, on the porch, caught in brambles by the path. All it needs is a place where someone believes that the right pressure in the right place can keep anything from breaking. That place is a person. I lay back and watched the ceiling. I could hike tomorrow into the desert, and the smell would follow me the way a name follows. I could press my palm to the seam on my wrist, and the seam would hum, pleased. I could wrap my whole head in a towel, in a shirt, in a pillow, and lie very still and let the world go on without me. Instead, I got up. I opened the motel's first aid kit and took out the roll of gauze inside it. I unwound it and unwound it and unwound it until the bathroom floor looked like a cloud brushed to pieces. Then I set a match to it, and the smoke alarm went off, and a man 2 doors down banged on the wall, and a woman shouted that someone had better not be smoking in there. And when the firefighter came 10 minutes later to shut off the screaming alarm, he made a note in a face and said, "Careful with gauze, that stuff flashes." "I know," I said. "I know." He left. The room was the kind of quiet you earn through embarrassment. I sat on the bed and looked at the seam on my wrist. It was still there. Of course it was. Fire does not erase a story. It only makes it easier to see for a while. I took the photograph from my bag. I looked at the little girl without a name and the woman whose hands had been kind and relentless. I turned the photo over and read, "I'm sorry, Joan," and understood that the apology had been both too late and not nearly late enough. When I finally closed my eyes, I made a promise to myself as austere as a stitched wound. I will not be held by a thing that believes all pain is the same. Morning came. The seam on my wrist paled into a suggestion I could ignore if I kept moving. I got in the car, which smelled mildly of burned plastic and, underneath, faintly of something wiped too clean. The glove box was closed. The notch where the torn strip had clung was empty. The seat creaked in regular patterns. On the way out of town, a man stood by the road with his thumb out. He wore a gray hoodie, his head down, the posture of someone who laid down a bag a mile back and forgot to pick it up. I slowed by reflex. The mind does this, tests all the old lessons. As I neared, he lifted his head. He had a bandage on his cheek, a little square tape there, one corner curling. He looked at me with the base, human hope of a person wanting to be collected. For a heartbeat, I saw the shape of him flutter, the suggestion of strips learning him. I sped up. He pulled his hand back. In the rear view, he shrank and then doubled in size as the mirror lied. Then he was fog again. My father would have said, "Sometimes you have to leave a thread in so the doctor knows where to cut. Sometimes it's the only way they find the wound." I keep driving now. I stop when I have to. I sleep when the world gets soft enough. The seam in my wrist has moods. Some nights it rises like a tide mark. Some nights it fades. Some mornings I wake with my arm tucked close to my chest as if I'm holding myself together out of habit. Some mornings I wake with both hands open and empty on the bedspread, and it feels like a refusal or a gift. I can't tell which. I tell myself the story right this time, that everything wants to be held together. Yes, but not all pressure heals. There are things you do not wrap. There are hurts that require air and salt and time, and a hand that rests near but not on. A week after I left the coast, a package arrived at my new apartment. No return address. Inside, a small, neat roll of gauze, stark white. It didn't smell like anything. I took it to the sink and soaked it in water until it collapsed like a lung. I wrung it out and set it on the counter to dry until it went stiff as paper and useless. Then I mailed it back to the sea. I'm not naive enough to think the sea needs my help getting what it wants, but the gesture was for me. The way you tie a ribbon to your own door to remember that you've been here before and do not need to go inside again. Sometimes, in the car, I feel the passenger seat accept a weight that isn't there. I keep my eyes on the road. I breathe. I refuse to learn the rhythm of the foghorn if the foghorn isn't sounding. I leave the radio off. The glove box stays closed. The photograph, though, I keep it. I hung it by the door, and I say the names when I leave and when I return. I tell them, I'll try to do better. I'll try to learn which wounds take a bandage and which ones take the air. I'll try to keep my hands gentle and, when gentle makes it worse, keep them away. If I fail, if the seam rises and the smell returns and the strips begin to edge under my door, I have a flare and I have a match, and I have a memory of a cabin perched over a violent sea, and I know the difference now between being safe and being still. The Bandage Man is out there, sure. He is a man when you need him to be, and a lesson when you don't. Sometimes he leaps into a truck bed and pounds the window and makes a driver spill his coffee. Sometimes he sits quiet in the seat beside a person like me and offers a simple thing in a complicated world. Let me hold you together. Sometimes I want to say yes. I don't. Or rather, I haven't yet. That is the most honest ending I have. Not a door slammed, not a monster burned out of existence on a cliff. Just this. The knowledge that some stories make you feel wrapped when what you need is to be unrolled and aired. That the same white strip can save a life on Tuesday and take one on Thursday. That the smell of iodine means both clean and wound, and you cannot have one without admitting the other is still here. I go on. The seam sleeps. The road does what roads do. And if you ride with me, if you sit in the passenger seat and feel the upholstery creak, if something brushes your arm and the air goes sharp and clean and terrible, do me a favor, look straight ahead, breathe through it. And when we reach a turnout and the ocean is a sheet of hammered light below us, help me open the door. Help me say the little word to the empty seat where a shape might be making itself again. No. Then help me say the bigger one. Not me, not now. And in the quiet after, when the foghorn is only memory and the smell fades and the road calls, sit beside me without touching. Let the space between us be not a wound but a decision. Everything wants to be held together, not everything should. I did not come to the glass orchard to chase a schoolyard ghost. I came for the mirrors. The estate agent on the phone had used a voice like wool, soft and cozy and sopping wet. All original fixtures, she said, an entire wing of 19th century mirrors, gilded, beveled, foxed with age. The executors need a complete inventory for the auction catalog. You'll have it entirely to yourself. Alone? I asked, because even at 33, I had never outgrown the way the word could ring. It's the off-season, she said, and laughed, and the house insists on good manners. You'll love it. By the time I arrived at the edge of the marsh, evening had fallen sideways, light faintly pink as if it had been pressed. The glass orchard sat beyond a gate choked with ivy, a brick and timber house arranged like a long corridor that someone had folded into a U. A gravel drive looped around a courtyard with a dry fountain. The windows had the over-ornate eyebrows of the Victorian taste. A brass plate, glass orchard, 1863. The air smelled of vinegar and cold rain. My breath came in milk-pale clouds. The key was under a frog-shaped rock where the agent had promised. Inside, the reception hall was mostly shadow, but the shadow had a sheen to it. It took me a heartbeat to realize that every wall was hung with mirrors, some covered in gauze like spider silk, some facing each other so the darkness inside them telescoped. The floorboards were old enough to sound hollow underfoot, and each step set loose a smell like old paper, like a cupboard that had not been opened in years. There was a guest ledger on a pedestal near the door, open to a blank page. There was a pen. I did not write my name. I chose the smallest bedroom, the one farthest from the heart of the house. It felt like a sin to choose anything grander when I would be here alone. The bed had a quilt whose pattern reminded me of snowflakes and shards of glass, and on the opposite wall there was a mirror, 7 feet tall and black with tarnish around the edges. My job was simple. Photograph each mirror. Note any markings, a maker's stamp, a dealer's plaque, any faults or cracks. I had a tape measure, a notebook, and the patient, secretarial calm that had finally settled over my life after the last 2 anxious years. There are worse places to spend 3 nights, I said out loud, to make a sound that wasn't the creak of old wood. The house did not answer, but the mirror on the wall caught the reflected sliver of my own mouth moving, out of sync by half a breath, and my scalp rippled the way it does when a cold draft finds you. It was almost funny how quickly the first omen arrived. The bathroom wasn't really a room so much as a closet with a sink and a clawfoot tub and a medicine cabinet with a mirror on the front of it. The mirror was the kind that reveals nothing kindly. The house's pipes banged and gargled when I turned the hot tap. Rusty brown water coughed and cleared as it ran. It took time for the steam to accumulate on the glass. When it did, I saw that finger marks had already scrawled through the fog, faint and vertical. Not a word or drawing, just 4 parallel strokes like the ghost of a small hand sliding down the inside of the mirror. I touched the glass. It was very, very cold. As I unpacked my equipment, I told myself a story to put the handprints away. Whoever lived here last had greasy, careless hands. They wiped at the mirror and left oils in the pattern of their fingers. Moisture finds those places first. Ordinary. A cause and effect. Facts. Facts were how I soothed myself. As a child, I had guarded little troves of them to use when my mind began to coil. For example, mirrors can never show you the back of your head without a second mirror. For example, a name said 3 times in the dark makes nothing happen, no matter what anyone says. For example, the thing you imagine standing behind you in a bathroom after midnight cannot step out of a silver surface because glass is a solid, and silvering is paint, and an old story cannot push into a new world. I could say Bloody Mary 3 times, the way we dared each other in 4th grade, the way we did more than dared. Lena had been the one to turn out the light in her grandmother's house. Lena with the star-shaped scar at the corner of her mouth from a bicycle fall. Lena who had invented dares as if they were shelves she climbed. She had locked the bathroom door, the 2 of us shut inside with the sink and the mirror and our own fear. I saw our faces hovering in it, my eyes already tearing, her mouth a fierce line, the candle on the toilet lid leaking wax in slow white tears that hardened on the porcelain. We'd said it together 3 times. The window had rattled with the wind like a hand trying the latch. The light had come back on, and nothing had happened. Nothing except that Lena's father had died that year, and Lena had moved away and sent me exactly 1 letter, which I had never answered because I was afraid of what I would have to say to balance the scales of her loss with the soft, ordinary weight of mine. Stop. Facts, not confessions. I closed the bathroom door, dried my hands, and went back to work. By midnight, I had cataloged 47 mirrors in the East Wing alone, some little plump ones with scalloped edges, some the tall kind that see everything below and nothing above a person's throat. Most of them were just mirrors. Some wore their years like a palimpsest, silver burned to brown at the corners, black freckles, veins of mercury like spiderwebs creeping inward. A few had interesting provenance. The largest had a plaque on the back stamped PNS 1872 and a yellowed label that read, "This piece supplied by Elsinore." I wrote the names down so I could look them up later, although Elsinore set off a faint twinge like a bell struck in another room. It was a long, hard day. A good day. By 2 in the morning, I was ready to stop thinking about glass and sleep. I shut the laptop, pulled the leftover sheets over my knees, and let the dark of the guest room press up against me like velvet. It was that perfect kind of house dark where the absence of streetlight is almost a texture of its own. I lay there and listened to wind search the eaves. Somewhere below, a draught set an old door to clicking against a warped jamb. Once the pipes burped, twice, 3 times. That number, my mind said helpfully. Then my mind said nothing at all, because I was asleep. When I woke the first time, it was because someone had tapped a fingernail on the other side of the bedroom mirror. 3 times. Deliberate, not settling. I stayed still and listened hard enough to hear the blood move in my temples. The house was quiet. The mirror did not knock again. I was an adult, and adults do not fear glossy rectangles that reflect their own beds back at them. I turned over and fell back into that first, deep sleep you get the first night in a strange place. The second time I woke, it was because I was cold. A draft slid under the covers and unfurled along my back. My mouth tasted like I had licked a spoon that had once held metal. My eyes were open, but the room looked wrong, as if the layout had been shuffled in my absence. I took a breath and let the relief of it warm my chest. Of course it looked wrong. The mirror across from me was no longer veiled in gauze. The gauze lay like a shed skin at the baseboard. The glass caught the faintest sliver of starlight from between the curtains and turned it into a blade. My own face watched me across the room, a square of paler dark, just awake enough to be useless. No one else was here. I was here. The window was shut. The door was shut. The mirror was uncovered for no obvious reason. I got up and crossed the room on bare feet, which made small sticky sounds as if the floor had been wiped with milk. I found the 2 pins that had fixed the gauze and patted them back into place above the frame. As I turned away, something tickled my hair, just a static charge. Just! I looked back. The gauze wasn't quite lying flat. It had a handprint in it, a suggestion more than a touch, the filigree of fingers pressed to the fabric from the glass side. I closed my eyes. I opened them. The handprint was gone. When I lay down again, I lay with my back to the mirror like a child. In the morning, nothing had changed, except that I had become someone who had slept with her back to a mirror. The same wasn't quite true of me in the house. The house had developed a smell that hadn't been there before, a smell like coal smoke and rosewater, like a vanity where someone had once heated curling irons, like hair scorched on a hot pipe. The smell ghosted from room to room, never quite leading anywhere. When I held still, it edged closer. I worked. That is how I live. I work, and what is not work waits. The West Wing held fewer mirrors but stranger ones, like the small black oval in a frame shaped like a crown. In that one I saw no reflections at all. The back of it was signed M. Elsinore and dated 1864. I put that into my notes and moved on, because the longer I stared at the empty oval, the more the empty seemed to notice. By afternoon, the sky had grayed completely down. Rain began with the sound of someone tapping a nail on the roof. It thickened until it sounded like someone throwing a jar of rice at a sheet of tin. The glass orchard dimmed and turned in on itself. Lamps made little circles of their own color. The mirrors inhaled those circles and breathed them back out differently. I kept working because it was either that or sit and listen while the house told me stories in a language I did not speak. At dusk, in a room that must have been a schoolroom once, long desk-faced windows, an empty slot where a blackboard had been, I found a mirror that made me stop. It was not especially large, an oval framed in dark wood braided like hair. The silver had gone smoky around the edges in the way of old field water, making the world beyond it look farther away. When I stood in front of it, I saw myself, but the line down the center of me didn't align with the one in the glass. It's hard to explain. It felt not like a flaw, but like intention. My face divided. The 2 halves did not quite agree on what each feature should be. 3 scratches ran down the glass to the left of my mouth, very faint and very straight. They started at about the level of my lower lip and ended just above where my throat hollowed. I touched them with the pad of my finger. They weren't on the surface. They were inside the mirror, like veins laid in the silver itself. I took a picture. The camera flashed and my reflection flinched after, not during. "Okay," I said, "not that." The schoolroom smelled like wet wool. My ears had filled with a quiet high ringing, the way they do when a television is on in another room. When I turned to leave, my coat sleeve brushed the blackboard notch and left a streak of white dust on the wool. I turned back to rub it off and noticed a string tied to the nail where the blackboard had been. A tag hung from the string, the kind you'd see on luggage or plants at a nursery. "Elsinore Glass," the tag said. Below, "Office." In pencil, someone had added, "Don't go." The someone had an uncertain hand. There was a little finger smudge at the corner of the sign, a crescent like a moon. I went. The office was not a real office. It was a short corridor tucked behind a narrow door, and it felt like the throat of the house. Shelves, cabinets, bells wired to a board, a window cut into the inner wall that looked not on the outside world but on the house's interior, as if the one who sat here needed to see who came and went. The desk was still there. On the desk was a black book. The book's spine read, "Discipline, 1864-1868. The pages rattled when I lifted them. Names marched down the lines. Girls with button-on names like Rosamund and Jane and Dorothea, next to neat notes, whispered in chapel, hair unbound at table, frightened others, sounded a story in the nights. For one girl whose name had faded, a longer note in a hand that had not learned mercy. Glass is not a toy. The name below was Mary. I sat down. There were more pages, more names. A row of little watches on the shelf ticked so softly it sounded like rain falling on wool. If I had not been sitting, I might have fallen. The air was so cold in the office, it felt wet. The last entry in the book was a thin black line and then a blot. There was no final page. The paper after was torn, a jag like a broken fingernail. On the floor beneath the desk, something caught my eye. A smear like dried cherry jam. It had the same tired red as rust. When I touched it, I discovered the one fact I did not need. It was still tacky. I backed out of the office and shut the door because for a moment I had the absurd certainty that if I did not shut the door, the office might have ideas about coming out. I walked away and tried to walk forward so quickly that my fear would not be able to keep pace. In the hall, the mirrors had convinced themselves that they were windows. Everything outside them was gray. Everything inside them seemed more brightly lit, as if there were a finer day on the other side. The mirrors did not reflect me as I passed. They reflected the hall itself, but empty, as if I had already left, as if I was on my way out and my absence was most real of all. I am not a superstitious person, and I do not have a talent for melodrama. I did not run. I made myself a cup of tea in the little kitchen at the end of the hall and sat at the small kitchen table with my notebook open and a pen trembling slightly between my fingers. The rain sounded friendlier with the kettle whistling nearby. I could smell the gas from the range. The light over the table is the kind of high bulb that makes circles under your eyes. I wrote out the names in the discipline book until the loop of them calmed me. When I stood to put the cup in the sink, I realized the back window had turned itself into a mirror. It was full dark outside, and the kitchen lights were bright. My reflection met me, my own slim shoulder, my hair tucked behind one ear, my mouth still drawn into the narrow line of someone thinking too hard. And then it smiled because I had not. I didn't drop the cup, proud of that. I set it down on the counter so carefully you could not have seen a vibration. I turned out the kitchen light, which should have left me in darkness, but did not. Something glowed very faintly outside, maybe a porch light on the far wing of the house. The window returned to being a window. My reflection was a slick of dark, my own ghost layered over the thinner ghost of the room. Glass does things, my mind said uselessly. Angles, refractions. There was a flaw in the pane. 2 panes doubled the image. Your eyes did not adjust in time. When I flipped the light on again, my reflection was late to follow. It lifted its hand and put its palm against the glass. My hand, when I raised it, was a beat behind. Our palms met. In the faint fog that the steam from the sink had breathed onto the window, the pane recorded the shape of our fingers. Mine was where my fingers were. The hand in the window was not. It slid down, 4 streaks, long fingernails, the exact shape I had seen in the bathroom the night before. "Okay," I said again, a useless word. Then I ran. Not because the reflection had moved, not because anything grabbed me, not because a voice whispered my name. I ran because the house suddenly felt like a mouth that was swallowing me, and my body decided to live because running is the opposite of being swallowed. I ran to the guest room. I threw the mirror gauze down and began to rip the pins out of every cloth cover I saw, not to uncover but to smother. If there had been paint, I would have painted them black. If there had been blankets enough, I would have swaddled them all. As it was, I managed to cover the one across from my bed, and the long one in the hall, and the chemist's mirror by the stairs, and the strange empty oval with the crown frame. I did not return to the schoolroom or the office. I had my own office now, my bed with the blankets over my shoulders, the door shut, the lamp on. People who know these stories better than I do always ask, why do you turn the light off? Why do you say the stupid words? Why do you go into the basement? The answer is, we need to change the rules. We cannot bear the world we are given, where all ghosts are private and grief is a room you cannot leave. So we make rules. We say 3 knocks and you have to answer, 3 times and a thing appears. Candles make a circle of safety. lights out, and the other side has the right of way. We offer bargains to old, impossible laws so we can watch them move, and then we can believe that we can move them. We can say a name and make a face appear. We can. We can. I did not turn the light off, but I did say her name. There are some words that knot themselves in your mouth, some names that have already been said in your throat before you arrive at them, because you grew up with them the way you grew up with a birthmark. You love them or you hate them, but either way, they live inside you. Bloody Mary, I said, to the only uncovered mirror left in the room, the little one on the dressing table behind a dish of hairpins I would never need. Bloody Mary. I could hear the rain considering whether it was going to continue. I could hear the whisk of the house's lungs as it drew in the damp. Third time, Bloody Mary. The lamp did not flicker. The glass did not ripple. There was no sound at all, not even the sound of my own breath coming back to me a half heartbeat late. A slice of something like pity went through me so sharply I put my hand to my stomach. I had called her like a child calls for a mother who may not exist, because the idea of the mother is still more beautiful than the fact of being alone. Then, slowly, the mirror did what mirrors are allowed to do. It copied the world. I watched myself lean forward, watched my face sharpen at the edges, as if the glass had made its mind up about me finally. The surface looked very slightly concave. I did not remember it being that way. My reflection looked very slightly wrong. The light grabbed the slope of my cheekbone and changed its angle by a degree. My mouth's corners turned down a hair. I watched my own pupils widen, caught by the idea that the mirror was not concave at all, but was drawing in, as if the space behind it were a lung that had decided to breathe. I know you, my reflection said, and I did not. The voice came from both sides of the glass at once. It had the tune of my voice, but a different weight, as if there were more throat behind it, more room in the chest. My reflection smiled with my mouth, showing slightly more teeth in the left corner than the right. An old trick of mine to conceal a crooked canine. I made my mouth the same way without meaning to. The mirror me lifted a hand and lightly tapped her throat with 3 fingers. The glass fogged where skin would never be. It's you, I said. You're me. This is a trick, a delayed feed from my phone camera, a hallucination born of exhaustion and the fact that I had not eaten supper. The reflection rolled her eyes, my face being used like a glove by someone who wore it too easily. You are not the only one who can memorize facts to make fear do tricks, she said. You think names belong to what they describe. They do not. They are ropes we throw in the dark and hope something with enough hand can catch. Mary is a rope with many knots in it. You tied yours the moment you refused to answer your friend's letter. Do you remember her? Lena. She said your name 3 times in her fear that summer. Where were you? Writing inventory? Hiding? I am not an old queen in a castle. I am this, a road between glass and mouth. I am the sound of your name when you do not answer. I could not help it. I said her name, Lena, like a coin I had finally remembered to spend, and the house, in its perfect old cunning, called my bluff. There was a new reflection behind the reflection, in the mirror, but deeper than my face, like a shadow thrown by someone standing in the hall. Not Mary, if you understand Mary, as the old woman in the story with hair that swims like black oil and eyes wiped bloody. Not a queen, not a mother, a girl, pale with the particular paleness of a body that spends each day inside trying not to disappoint a system designed to punish anything except dullness. A girl with a star-shaped scar at the corner of her mouth. The mirror me stepped aside. She made room with a little flourish, gallant as a maitre inviting a favorite guest to a table by the window. Don't, I said, don't do this. But the mirror is not a moral instrument. It shows what is put in front of it. The figure stepped forward until she stood where I stood in the room, which is to say, she stood where I had stood years ago, in Lena's grandmother's bathroom, candle on the lid of the toilet, the wax making tears. She did not look at me. She looked at the mirror. My hand lifted without my permission and hovered over the surface, not touching, and yet so close that it made the tiny hairs on the back of it arc. What do you want? I asked Mary, or the road that had answered to Mary, or the shape that had borrowed my face and my voice and leaned into my life in the place a friend should have been. My job, she said, and smiled again, teeth a neat row of white mistakes. You have called me 3 times in your life, and each time you thought you did not mean it. 3 is a number I respect. 3 knocks, 3 wishes, third time's a charm. 3 nights you promised to this house. On the third, I am allowed to step through. I don't want. It is not about want. Then about what? Balance, she said, with a little shrug. You decided you could fix grief by believing in a rule. You refused to learn the right rule. Here is the right rule. If a girl calls a name to the dark and no one answers, the mouth that is the answer is allowed to come find her. I'm not a girl. You are when you are afraid. The room had become so cold my breath left little silver texts in front of me. The mirror had become so warm its surface gleamed as if someone had breathed on it from the other side and then stood very still, waiting for the fog to go. The rain had stopped. The house's little ancient sounds went quiet, as if it had set its teeth. I will not let you out, I said. It isn't fair. It's cheap. You were the one who turned a woman with a name into a trick, she said. I am not fair. I am not cheap. I am exactly what you ought to have expected. Old, patient, unavoidable. If you do not want me to step through as myself, then I will step through using something you made. I will use your guilt the way a hunter uses a path. Behind my reflection, Lena lifted the candle. Helpers, it said, in a tone my grandmother would have used to describe a rival church's potlucks. Your kind comes to open your mouths at our pain. You call us story. You take our voices and put them in little black boxes. You take them home to rooms with air that moves the way you tell it to. You play us on loops until we are smaller. I archive, I said, which sounded pitiable and small even to me. I don't exploit, I keep. It matters. The canyon hummed, considering the word like a new mineral on its tongue. Keep, it said. Yes, you keep. And what do we keep when you keep us? The shape of our throat when it closes, the shape of our hands when they hold a knife, the wet we made with our own. The canyon didn't finish the sentence, and the part of me that had come to test and measure retreated from that mercy the way a hand retracts from a coil of wire. The seep in the sand widened. I watched a thread of water stitch one patch of dark to another, a seam that gleamed and then dulled as sand drank it. The air cooled fast. The temperature drop can be surgical in the desert at night, one blade straight through the hours between day and day. My breath hung. It felt wrong to let it hang. I stood and found the tape, found the tripod, broke the rig down in motions so practiced that the canyon couldn't steal them from me. Each rubber foot came up from sand with a faint kiss. I coiled the cables into rings small enough to tuck into my pack. I shouldered more weight than I had brought in. My gear had sucked in dark while I wasn't looking. Going, I said. I'm going. The canyon's voice softened again, and in that soft I heard children taught to be polite even when polite doesn't serve. Take us with you, it said. No, I said, but I wasn't sure. The headlamp worked hard on the walk back. I moved careful and still scraped my knee on stone slick as biscuit dough. Blood warmed one leg. Sweat made salt maps drying on my shirt. Twice, 3 times, I turned to check that my trail marker tape still caught the beam, and twice, 3 times it sparkled like the eye of something that didn't have nerves. I made the mouth of the canyon in a rush I told myself was not a run, and stepped out into a night that felt hot despite the dark. The car was where I had left it. The key turned in the ignition with a sound that, just for a second, translated in my head into the canyon's word, hungry. The headlights carved 2 holes into the world. The dirt road unrolled like receipt paper. I didn't check the rear view until I hit the county highway. When I did, the darkness behind me was only darkness. I laughed once, and then my throat tightened, and no sound came. I drove to a motel whose sign promised clean, quiet air, and pulled the blanket back from a bed that knew too many bodies. I laid the recorder on the nightstand like a reliquary. I turned the air conditioning to a number that would insult an ice cube. I tried to sleep and failed, and tried again and found a thin line of unconsciousness that the machines held steady. When I woke at 7, in an airless morning that needed coffee to turn itself into day, I reached for the recorder the way a hand reaches for a pulse after a surprise. I plugged it into the motel's television and listened. As expected, the gear had caught everything. The wind and the lullaby that wasn't, and the children's hunger, and the canyon's insistence that the man had come home. I listened to the place performing itself and tried to map all the standing waves it made out of pain. Then I heard something I hadn't heard when I'd stood inside it. My own voice singing. It came out of the recording as if I had leaned in close to the microphone and let my mouth brush the foam. It was a lullaby my mother had sung in a language her mother had taught her, half English and half other, a tune my throat knows like a tongue knows teeth. On the recording it tumbled out in the precise cadence of my grandmother's sighs. Sleep, little bird, it said. Sleep, little bone. And the word bone cracked like old paint. I hadn't sung. I scrubbed backward and listened again. The recorder did not care whether I believed what I heard. It simply played. On the second pass, I caught ghosted under the lullaby another sound, my name, whispered in the dry, economical voice with which the canyon had tried on my words. Then a child's whisper overtopped both. Now we can sleep. I have friends who would have published. I have friends who would have cut that minute, looped it, layered whisper over whisper until it held the shape of fear listeners pay to have climb their spines, then sold ad slots against it. I have friends who would have sat very still and listened until they could name each voice in the chorus, then gone back to the canyon with gifts and cameras and prayers disguised as plastic. I took the memory card out and set it on my palm and thought how easy it would be to crack it with 2 fingers and be done. The problem with hearing is that once you've heard, you can't go back to a moment in which you hadn't. The line between the canyon and the motel room with its cigarette ghosts and its 2 white sheets had already blurred. The air conditioner's drone wore a canyon's coat now. The ice machine down the hall threw cubes like bones into a plastic throat and they tinked, and the sound reached me after a delay that made me want to put my hands over my ears until the world smoothed back into something a body could live in. "Take us with you," the canyon had said. I put the card back into the recorder, and the recorder into the bag, and the bag into the trunk. I drove away from Kingman and the flags with their 2 blades of shadow, and the wash that doesn't ever want to be called a river unless it gets to be a river for real. I told myself I would file the tapes in a folder named for the year and the day, and that maybe later I would revisit the spectral stuff, peel it apart, see what had been physics, and what had been the simple human willingness to pattern noise into meaning. The first night back in my apartment, I woke at 2 a.m. with a taste in my mouth like a penny under the tongue. The refrigerator hummed like anything that makes cold out of warm. The building's old pipes settled, talking to one another in clicks. I lay still and listened because that's who I am. Off beyond the wall, someone's baby cried, one note, then another, then a breath caught in a throat. The crying got louder as it crossed brick and paint and air and bedspread. "Stop," a woman whispered from the hallway, not to me, and the crying stopped the way a tide stops, slowly, with the wet still pulling. I rolled onto my side and looked at the red eye of the recorder on the nightstand, dead as a marble, no battery inside. I looked and the recorder looked back with its own dead eye, and we had a quiet conversation about choice. He came home, the canyon had said, and it had not lied. He came home and hunger came with him, and the river took its fraction no matter how late he tried to hold against it. He came home and the story grew teeth. He came home the way I came home, carrying the canyon in a little black box. At 3 a.m, the hour when everything you are thinks very clearly about turning into something else entirely, I got up and took the recorder into the kitchen and laid it on the counter. I got a hammer from the top of the refrigerator where I keep things I don't like to see. I raised it and held it and did not bring it down. If you ask why, I don't know if I can answer. Maybe the same impulse that takes you down a road you know won't be on a map. Maybe I am as susceptible to a place's gravity as anyone, just better at telling myself that I'm measuring it instead of drowning in it. Maybe part of me wanted to keep a proof that the world can still surprise us, even if the surprise is teeth in the dark. I put the hammer back. I took the recorder and slid it into the freezer, where I file food I can't afford to throw away even though I probably won't eat it. Cold, I told myself, does not stop sound, but it slows certain kinds of rot. I slept then until the sun did the work of mourning and pulled me through the thread of consciousness into a day that had coffee and emails and a meeting where a woman with clean teeth and a smarter job title than mine said the word deliverable so often it turned into a bug I wanted to squish. I pretended to be another person, one whose job is to make small promises and keep them. I did not open the freezer. I did not listen. 2 nights later, the apartment made itself quiet the way a nervous thing makes itself small. The refrigerator's hum cut. The pipes stopped talking. The hallway held breath. I lay in bed with the blanket pulled up like a polite apology. From the freezer, through the closed door, through a layer of dull frost that has a taste like old coins, came the sound of water finding sand. "Sleep," my own voice sang, very softly, in a throat colder than any I have carried around with me. "Sleep, little bird. Sleep, little bone." I got up and stood barefoot on tile that had kept the day's heat exactly long enough to give it to my feet. I opened the freezer. Frost breathed in my face. The recorder lay where I had set it, red-eyed dark, no battery in its belly. The sound didn't come from the machine. It came from the little hard box of air itself, from the crystals pressed into one another like geodes waiting to crack. Water tinkles as it changes shape. If you want, you can mistake that for a lullaby. If you want, you can mistake a lullaby for a promise. What I do next may make me a coward to you. It may make me clever. I took the recorder from the freezer and set it on the counter and waited a moment for the frost to thin. I slid the memory card out and held it in my fingers until it warmed. I bent it with a steady force. Plastic bent. The card snapped, a dry, efficient sound I felt in my teeth. I dropped the pieces into the trash and put my hands on either side of the sink and stayed there breathing until my breath sounded like mine again. The quiet afterward was not generous, but it was mine. I still dream a canyon with a throat shaped like a woman saying yes 3 times, as if that could change the word. I wake sometimes with the taste of bread I haven't eaten in years, the kind you bake because you want to store sunlight in a crust. There are Tuesdays when the water in the pipes steps down one valve at a time, and I know the exact pattern of the pebbles that made that music for me once. There are nights when a neighbor's baby cries and the crying is only crying, the simple complaint of a body that hasn't yet learned what the world can ask. I have not gone back. I have also not erased the folder named for the day in my computer. Not because there's anything in it. There isn't. There are only the empty architecture of directories and a name like a trail marker. But because the world is full of things that exist whether or not we keep a record, and I need, some nights, to open the folder and see the word there and remind myself that I am a person who both heard and said no. Sometimes, when I am very honest with myself, I wonder if the canyon oiled the inside of my ears and slid something into them while I stood with a knife and a headlamp and a foolish stubbornness. Sometimes I catch myself humming the wrong song in the grocery line. Sometimes the word hungry folds itself against my ribs like a bird that has decided to make a home. He came home, the canyon said. He came home. If there's a lesson in that for anyone who listens at the doors of other people's pain, it's this. Coming home doesn't let you leave the river behind. It runs with you. It keeps. It makes its own echoes. And sometimes, if you are not careful, you bring them to bed and lay them on the nightstand and teach them to sing in your own voice. If you want the ending, here it is. I deleted the backup I had forgotten I had. I threw the recorder away. I bought another and told myself I would only use it in places that smell like moss and not like coins. Sometimes I keep that promise. Sometimes I don't. The canyon is still there, starving and endless, and on certain nights when the wind drops into the right pocket and the town goes quiet, the way animals go quiet before weather, people say they hear a woman's voice at the edge of the wash. Not a scream, not anymore. Something like a song, something like a hush. Maybe she finally found what she begged for. Maybe the canyon fooled her, and she fooled it back. Maybe, like everyone who ever goes to a place for a story, I became one small line in the larger echo, and what I did with the line didn't matter. What matters is that the world keeps speaking. What matters is that places remember. What matters is that I am not sure whether I would have chosen differently if the canyon had asked for anything else but quiet. Tonight, the building's heater is clanking itself polite. The neighbor, 2 doors down, is making pasta, and the sauce tells the air about garlic. A car's tires pull water from blacktop and lay it down again. I am writing this because it felt like a thing that needed writing, because there's a difference between keeping and telling, and I'm trying to learn it. I don't know if this is an open door or a closed one, a resolved chord or just the suspended note before gravity takes it where it would go anyway. I know that if I hold my breath and count, slowly, to 3 on the exhale I hear, very faintly in a thinnest thread, the sound of water finding sand. I do not go to the freezer. I do not go to the sink. I do not say yes 3 times. I let the sound pass me as if it belonged to the apartment above mine, as if there were a river running through her kitchen and not through me. And if sometimes when I am alone, I sing under my breath a song my grandmother taught me, I make sure to end it wrong. I change the last word. I teach my mouth to land on live instead of sleep, on bird instead of bone. If the canyon can bend echoes, then I can bend too. I can take one small stitch out of a story so old it thinks it is the truth. I can tell myself that even if I can still hear those children learn to be hungry, even if the river still asks, I will give it nothing but the clean sound of my own no, bright as a harmonica note rising, not quite in tune, maybe but enough to cut, enough to carry, enough to return to me in a shape I can stand. I came to the canyon because of a sound. Not a song, exactly. Not the kind of thing you could hum on the way from the kitchen to the sink. It was a smear of syllables the wind made when it pushed itself through broken rock, a wet keening that rose from the Snake River's throat when the water slid fast and thin over basalt shelves. In Pocatello, they said the water talked. In Massacre Rocks, they said it remembered. I told myself I was here to record, to catalog an urban legend for a graduate paper that had been drifting, barely afloat, for months. The truth was less presentable. I was sleepless, hollowed out by a kind of silence that had followed me from apartment to apartment, city to city, the kind of quiet that crowded your skin from the inside. I thought maybe if I stood in a place where the wind and water never stopped speaking, the quiet would let me go. The cabin I'd rented sat squat on a raised pad upstream of the park campground, a weather-gray box that smelled of cedar chips and damp wool. In the late light of my first November afternoon, the canyon looked false, like a cutout held against a backlit sky. Cottonwoods grabbed at the wind with branches full of rattling seed pods. Basalt heaved up in dark humps, dimpled like the backs of sleeping animals. The river ran wide and colorless, quick where it split around low islands and thick where it pooled, skin wrinkling as if something beneath it were puckering up for breath. "You picked the lonely season," the caretaker said. He wore the same faded parka every day by the look of it. The elbows had gone shiny from years of use. He'd met me on the gravel pullout, and we stood hip-deep in air that smelled like pennies and sage. "No one's out here after Labor Day. They like it that way, I think." "They?" He swallowed whatever else he'd meant to say and looked past me toward the water. "If you hear crying at night," he said finally, "close your windows. Don't go down to the bank. It's steeper than it looks." I forced a laugh that sounded like a cough. "I'm not going to jump because of some campfire story." "You won't jump." He hooked his thumbs into his pockets. "You'll lean, trying to figure out where that sound is coming from. The edge gives easy after a week of freeze. The river doesn't give anything back." He handed me the cabin key and drove away, leaving the scent of diesel and wet leaves. I watched his taillights fade along the park road and told myself people like to scare the gullible. I told myself stories wanted to be stories. I told myself a lot of things, the way you do when you've already decided to stay anyway. Inside, the cabin was colder than the outside air, as if the hollow space had been storing night. I turned on the baseboard heaters, then lit a fire because the sound of it, soft, purposeful, made the thin walls feel thicker. I set up my field kit, microphones, cables, the recorder with its blinking red eye. I hadn't brought much else. One suitcase, a wool hat, a thermos, a book about Shoshone-Bannock myth and the ways pioneers had rewritten it to fit their fear. At dusk, the canyon turned the color of an old bruise. The river darkened from silver to slate. When the first coyote called, the sound dragged gooseflesh up my arms. I made tea, wrapped my hands around the mug, and listened with the cabin lights off so the outside could come in unfiltered. Wind hissed through the grass. Something larger, elk, moved with the careful heaviness of a body on unfamiliar ground. In the half hour after sunset, the temperature dove like a stone. That's when I heard it. It might have been a bird at first. A single note, high and mewling, floated from the river and snagged on the deck rail. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't fox or vole. It climbed, then fell off a cliff of silence so abruptly that my breath tightened in sympathy. I clicked the recorder on without looking. The red light felt too bright. I slid open the door and stepped onto the deck. Air slapped my face cold. The river laid its sound down in layers, slap, rush, hiss, tick, and under it, that mewling again, longer this time, a tug on some dull string between spine and stomach. "Just water," I said, because talking made me feel less like a thing listening and more like someone choosing to listen. I set the microphones on the railing and pointed them toward the bank. Just the river wearing a mask. But the third time it came, it was two notes together, braided and thin. The fourth time, a soft hiccup between. The fifth time, a wet choke, not like water but like breath in a throat too small to hold it. I shut the door. I told myself myths learn you as much as you learn them. I dragged the armchair closer to the fire and read about emigrant graffiti carved into nearby rock, about how the pioneers named massacre rocks before anything happened because their fear came first and named things afterward. I fell asleep with the book open on my lap and woke at midnight to the faint sound of water running. The cabin sink had a spacious rusted bowl and a faucet that stuck halfway open. A single luminous tendril of water threaded from spout to basin, the drip too steady to be called a drip. I turned the knob hard left, then right, then back again, and the water refused to stop. The handle had always had play in it, old cabins leak. I twisted until my palm ached. The thread thinned, trembled, and quit. I went back to the armchair and pulled the blanket up to my chin. Somewhere in the dark, something tapped against glass in a soft start and stop rhythm. The deck, I thought. The wind, maybe cattails, something. You don't come to a place like that and expect to sleep well. In the morning, the light came thin and ungenerous. Frost whispered across the deck boards. On the railing, the microphones had blown askew. I brought them in and found a film of damp on their grills, the kind that takes a long time to accumulate. In the tea mug I'd left near the sink, I found a crescent of silt, as if a dirty finger had drawn the curve of a moon along the porcelain. Outside, below the deck steps, the dirt was stamped with marks like commas. Not footprints, the way we think of them, but narrow arcs a few inches long and an inch wide. A line of them led from the bottom step to a wet patch beneath the eaves. The patch had a wavering edge, the earth darker where it had drunk more, light where it had shied away. I crouched, hooked 2 fingers under a layer of the damp soil, and pinched a segment of clay from the ground. It held its shape long enough to carry to the edge of the deck and knead between my fingers while I watched the river. The wind licked the tips of the sage. A hawk swam the air above the rocks and never seemed to arrive anywhere. By the river path, the park had posted the usual informational signs: geology, flora, a chipped placard about an emigrant named Osborne who carved his wife's name into what was now called Register Rock. Below those, someone had taped a hand-drawn notice with a strip of dull blue painter's tape. Watch your children. Stay back from the water. No swimming, no wading. River ice breaks easy. Easy, not easily, as if what broke wanted to. I followed the path until it ended at a narrow beach of round stones that clicked against each other like teeth when the water washed over them. I stayed well back from the waterline, because even on a bright morning, the snake looked intractable, iron tough and cold. In the distance, the largest of the massacre rocks hunched halfway into the channel, a black shoulder causing a gather and curl. When the current hit that obstacle, it changed its mind and went sideways, shrugged, sank, the surface writhed, and the sound shifted. For half a second, the whine of it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I lifted the recorder. Wind smacked the mics and pushed their bellies full. I lowered the gain and listened to the headphones until the image sharpened. Hiss of trees, click of stones, one lone crow somewhere above. No crying. The river, at least in daylight, had better things to do. I had arranged for an interview at the university with a folklore adjunct willing to talk on a Friday afternoon if I brought coffee and the promise not to publish his name. He told me the story as if he were reluctant to let it be heard. They call them water babies, he said, and the fluorescent light made his face look like paper. That's the white version, not the same as the Shoshone Bannock stories, which are bigger and older than what the emigrants were carrying. It's the emigrant fear that stuck. You know the famine story, how some mothers— I know it, I said, not because I was squeamish, but because I wanted him to not have to say it, to not set that ugliness down like a plate between us. What do you think people hear? Whatever they need to. He stirred a coffee 2 sugars too far. We don't so much hear as fill in the blank. The brain holds a blank like a mouth holds breath. It wants to release it, and the way it lets go is with a story. What did you hear? I asked. He blinked at the coffee as if he'd forgotten it was there. A snowmelt day 4 years ago, he said finally, when the bridges were trembling. I thought it was a boat. I remember knowing it was a boat, an aluminum one with a motor and a prop that wasn't fully out of the water. But there wasn't a boat, and then I wanted there to be one. What about the babies? He made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had more flesh on it. If you hear a baby crying and you're alone, what do? You look, I said, even if you know you shouldn't. You go to the edge, and the edge is a liar. On the way back to the park, a ring of cloud formed around the low sun. a faint white halation that made the canyon's mouth look like the rim of a frozen cup. The caretaker's truck was parked by the ranger house. I stopped and leaned into the open driver's side window, which smelled like cold coffee and old hay. "What's the trick to the sink?" I asked. "The faucet drips. I twisted it and got it to stop, but—" "A drip means you've got a seal problem," he said. "In old cabins, everything's a seal problem. I'll bring a wrench tomorrow." He squinted at me from beneath the brim of a cap printed with an old rodeo logo. "You hear anything last night?" "Just the usual. Wind. Coyotes." "Uh-huh," he said, and I couldn't tell if he didn't believe me or if he wanted to. The second night, I put the recorder on the windowsill, because if you come for a sound, you might as well make it easy for it to come to you. The wind came in a coil, one long exhale that wrapped itself around the cabin and squeezed until the logs creaked. I made soup and ate it too quickly and burned the top of my mouth. I called no one, because there was no one to call who wouldn't listen carefully for what I wasn't saying. Just before 11, the crying began. It wasn't outside. Not first. It was a wet, threaded sound that came up through the pipes, an infant weep whistling down a throat of galvanized steel. I stood in the bathroom with the light off and my hands on the cold porcelain sink. The mirror breathed a fog of my own making. Behind it, a darker gray shifted. At the edge of my vision, something crossed the shower curtain like a shadow of a hand. The sound from the pipes thinned, thickened, went silent. In the quiet, I heard water slap wood. Deckboards, I thought, some storm blow-off. Then I heard a series of wet little breaths. No, not breaths, just the suggestion of them. And when I opened the bathroom door, I could hear them from the kitchen, too. I turned my head, and they went away, as if they were attached to the corner of my eye and would move if it moved. If you hear a baby crying and you're alone, what do? I shut off the recorder, even though that's not what a careful researcher would do. I doused the fire because the snap of it had started to sound like distant gurgling. I turned off every light and sat in the armchair in the dark, with the blanket pulled to my chin like a child. The crying rose and rose until it reached something that wasn't sound anymore, but the shape sound makes in your body. It was a little like standing too close to an amplified bass speaker, the way your ribs vibrate. "Stop," I said, because coaxing often matters less than command. "Please stop." It stopped. The silence spun out rope distance long. The wind had been wrong earlier. Now it was less a direction and more a pressure, the whole canyon full of it, pressing down. In the pressure, a tap, tap, tap at the glass, gentle, insistent, near the door. I didn't move. I let the taps count themselves. I let my breath count them, because numbers are something to hold when you have nothing else. 7, 11, 23. The taps paused, began again. I made it to 50 before the knuckles of my left hand had gone stiff from gripping the blanket. "Stop," I said again, and my voice pulled the taps close enough to my face that I could feel the brush of cold air where they met the pane. 1, 2, 3. When the sun finally came up, it did it grudgingly, like a child hanging back at a doorway to be reminded. Light seeped in under the blinds. I stood and forced my body to cross to the door and open it. Wet crescents marked the deck in 2 staggered rows. Not footprints. Not human. A track made by something small, shifting its weight, heel and toe reversed, like half-moons pressed by palms. They went from the railing to the bottom of the door as if something had stood there on something taller, rail, chair, and reached to tap the glass. A smear of moisture swiped the lower third of the pane, as if something had palmed it and slid down. I knelt and put my hand against the deck. Cold radiated up through the old boards the way a memory does, not painful but persistent. I wanted there to be mud stuck to the door. I wanted there to be cattail fluff, leaf bits, any evidence the wind could have used as fingers. There was only water and the faintest residue of fish, like a cleaned sink. I spent that day in town, even though the town looked like all towns when winter leans in. Low skies, people walking faster than necessary, grocery store aisles full of food wrapped in plastic. In a second-hand shop, I bought a heavy blue wool sweater because the cabin had the kind of chill that lives in wood. In a pharmacy, I bought a plug-in nightlight shaped like a bear because the dark had stopped being brave and started being a dare. In the university library, I requested a file about drownings in Bannock County and read until my eyes went hot. The numbers were what you'd expect from a river this size, unforgiving in certain years, then quiet, then suddenly mean again when the snowpack came down fast in spring. On the third night, it rained. Not a lot, just enough to make the air audible. The river took that sound and made it into something wider. I laid the microphones on the sill and went to bed because the body has a small voice that sometimes insists it's done being awake. The dream started with a bright bowl of water. I was carrying it carefully across a room I didn't recognize. The bowl was made of black glass, and when I breathed on it, the surface fogged like a mirror. Inside, something moved. A fish, I thought. A small one with a coin-bright head and a body that trailed off as if the artist had stopped carving halfway. I wanted to put the bowl down before I dropped it, but the only surface available was a windowsill with a thread already laid across it. The thread was water. It reached with its clear body to touch the bowl, and where it did, the bowl sighed like a sleeping child. When I woke, the room smelled like wet stone and old milk. The heater had cycled off without telling me. The lights of the nightlight made a soft bear of light on the floor. Through the half-open door, I could see the bathroom mirror and the shape of my own head in it, except my head was dipped forward as if I were looking at the sink, which I wasn't. I sat up, hard enough that the bed squealed and complained. The shape in the mirror did not lift. It stayed bent, as if combing long hair I no longer had. The voice came from below the floorboards. It said my name. Not right, not wrong. As if it had learned to make my name by listening to me say it into voicemail greetings and takeout orders, then rubbed that sound against a rock until it fit the mouth that wanted to use it. My nightlight went out. The bear collapsed into a small dark bear the size of my palm, then nothing. The cabin made a long sound, the kind of creak that crosses itself. The voice said my name again, this time almost peevish. I slid my foot into my boot and looked for the other and found it over by the door, closer to the glass than I would ever have left it. I put the recorder in my coat pocket because habit is the strongest form of hope. I stood at the door with the darkness pressing against its far side like a patient hand. I told myself a brave story about being the person who can look first. I opened the door and the night leaned in. "You can't come inside," I said, on the off chance that rules mattered. The crying was walking away from the cabin, not traveling along the river like water, not traveling in the air like wind. Walking. It made itself into sound from one place, by the cottonwoods, and then from another, near the old fire ring, and then from the path as it curved down to the gravel bar. It always paused long enough between locations for me to see where it had gone and ask myself whether I would keep following. "Fine," I said, which is how I have always gotten into trouble. At the edge of the path, the soil had gone from hard to sponge. Each step returned my weight like a lie with a gift in its mouth. The cottonwoods shook themselves, the seed pods rattled, the sound resolved into a dry rain. I kept a ridiculous distance from the water, as if 6 more feet would make a difference if the earth decided to relax. The crying came again from up ahead, skittered to my left, then quieted until it was just the suggestion of sound packed into the river's broader hiss. Wind pushed the river into humps. It made the dark close over the water like lids. The rocks rose up like humps of something sleeping, and then slouched away when I looked directly at them. I reached the spot where the gravel bar had pinched down into a kind of isthmus, a causeway between the bank and a bulge of basalt that should never have been there, but always had been. The river had thrown little shells of foam at it, busted them, then taken them back. The crying stopped. It didn't trail off. It cut out. You know how animals freeze when they're startled and their stillness is a shout? The night did that. "What do you want?" I asked, which was not the right question, but it was the most human one. The recorder tick-clicked in my pocket as it always does when it saves a file, a happy little instrument sure that this, at least, was its purpose fulfilled. What moved then did not move like one thing. The water undercut the edge with a sound like unzipping. The packed dirt collapsed, taking a slice of grass and sedge with it. The ground was there, and then it didn't believe in itself and was not. I fell onto my knees and scrambled backward, but the heel of one boot met nothing, and my weight followed. I slid. My right boot filled with water so quickly the temperature bit my ankle hard enough to feel like a blow. then the left, then the water to my calves, then my hips. The river lifted its cold body against mine, and the cold moved through my clothes with miserly purpose. Something small and slick struck the outside of my knee. Another slipped against my shin and wrapped itself around, then squeezed. The water had hands. No, the water had mouths trying to be hands. I thrashed away a child does, wastefully and full of conviction. My elbow hit rock, which hurt in the ordinary way, and I clung to that pain like identification. The river took the opportunity to grab the rest of me. It happened so fast that I didn't have time to breathe wrong. I was under, the world all boulder and winter, and what light there was rubbed itself thin against the surface above me. It's true that rivers have mouths. It's also true they don't close them. In the little light, between layers of water, something gathered. They weren't babies. If you put a baby in your mind, then moved the parts around until a fish could wear them, you'd be closer. Their heads rounded under the skin of water, eyes too far apart, mouths too wide as if sliced by a blade too big for the job. Their arms were fins until they needed to be arms. Their fingers were not fingers until they were inside my mouth. One slid its palm over my mouth and pushed, as if encouraging me to open. Another found my nose and sealed it with a small insistence. The pressure wasn't punitive, it was coaxing. They wanted my mouth open. They wanted the water to go in. They wanted me to breathe where I should not, and when I should not, the way a few crying things convince you to do all sorts of impolite things with your body. The softness of their skin was wrong, not because it was soft, but because it was the wrong kind of soft, like fruit ripened out of season. I clutched the rock and pulled and made no headway at all. The current poured itself against my ribs, and the ache it made held notes, little ones that added up to a chord. In that chord was a voice that wasn't a voice. Give, it said. Give, and you won't be alone. Not words, not memory, but the thought of arms that were not mine holding me up, of a bowl of water that promised a child if I just kept carrying it through this room and never set it down. A shape rose from behind the babies. I knew it was bigger because the water drew itself around that shape more than it drew itself around mine. It lifted a thin cloud of silt off the riverbed, the way you might lift a sheet in a dark room. Hair moved and didn't. Not hair but filament, algae in long lines, a black veil worn underwater by someone who had been waiting in these clothes a long time. I would have named it Mother if the thing inside that word hadn't panicked so hard. My hands went to rock again. You'll be a good one, it said without sound. You carry carefully. Let me take you into the deep part where it's quiet, and we will take turns breathing. No, I thought, because in that thought was a kind of prayer I hadn't used since I was 8, and had hit my head on the side of a pool and seen the world magnified and split. I did what the caretaker had told me, the thing that was only a footnote to a dozen other warnings. If you get pulled under, don't fight straight up. Roll on your back and float your arms out and let the river make you into something that doesn't catch. I went still enough to feel the river agree I was no longer interesting. The little hands pressed harder at my mouth and nose, alarmed that their gentle instructions weren't working. A webbed thumb slid between my teeth. It tasted like pennies and milk turned wrong in a hot room. My lungs crowded the inside of my chest with fire the cold couldn't restrain. I slipped one hand from the rock and stretched it sideways the way you reach for a chain under a dock. There was no chain. There was a root. There was a slice of basalt that rose and gave and rose again. The river had cut a step into it, one I could put the edge of my boot on. I planted my heel like a flag and pushed until something in my knee made a noise like a small knuckle cracking. I rose enough that my face touched air. 2 wet hands, still insisting, slid from my mouth to my cheeks as if petting. I opened my mouth and spit river back into river. I held the root like an old friend's wrist. The larger shape rose with me, patient, as if I were the slowest dancer. Stop, I said, not because it would, and not because I believed in what voices can do, but because the sound of my own body sending words out was the only thing that I could be sure belonged to me. Stop, I said again. And then, because there was nothing left to try and because it had seemed to make a shape in the air before, I did something I had never done for anyone. I sang. Not really a song. The bare bones of a lullaby my grandmother had already stripped of its words, just the rocking of it left. The way you might hum to yourself when you're pretending you don't hear the crying, because you have to butter the bread and set it under the broiler, and you will do the milk next. The tune made a piece of the cold go quiet. The fingers at my mouth loosened in surprise. The big shape waited. The little ones clustered to my chest, as if waiting too. I edged my boot up another inch against the basalt, and then another, rocking back and forth in time with my own stupid song, and the motion gave me a few more inches of leverage, enough to lift my chin and hook it over air again. I don't know if the river forgave me for not going where it wanted. It didn't pull me better, but it didn't pull me worse. I inched sideways along the undercut lip, singing and gasping, until the bank didn't want to be a liar anymore and remembered how to be dirt. I flopped onto it and made the sound a person makes when they're too cold to be out of the cold, a high keening that wasn't crying and wasn't not. The little handprints followed me to the hemorrhaging edge and stopped. The bigger shape pulled out of itself and let the tops of the long black filaments rest on the surface as if showing me hair, or as if showing me roots. "You promised," the water said with no words. "You started to." "I didn't promise," I said, "because sometimes the only rope you have is the smallest truth." I sang. The shape drew itself down. The water smoothed, the night unclenched. The crying that had led me there came once more from a distance, as if someone had packed it into a body and carried it away across the rocks. I crawled to the path and sat there until I was sure I would not shatter if I stood. When I did, I left a trail that led back to the cabin, like the ones animals leave when they are bold enough to go home bleeding. Inside, the floor was warmer than I deserved. I peeled the wet layers off and dried my face and hands with a towel the park had bleached so bright it hurt to look at. When the heater came on, its small courage made me cry for the first time, just long enough to put water where it belonged. Out. I slept only because bodies will take their due. In the morning, the caretaker knocked, and his presence at the door made the cabin look like it had always expected him. "Sink wrench," he said, holding up a metal tool like a badge. Then he looked past me. I could see him see the wet footprints my boots had made from the door to the bath, the towel in a heap. His face had all the expressions of a person deciding which joke to make and losing them in order. "You fell in." I slipped. I tried to unclench my jaw and failed. He set the wrench on the counter gently, as if it could bruise. "You hear anything before that?" I thought about telling him no. I thought about telling him I heard coyotes. I thought about telling him some very normal thing about wind. Instead, I said, "Yes." He nodded, not because that was the answer he expected, but because it was the answer that existed. He ran the faucet, turned it off, listened to the stubborn drip reassert itself in 3 patient beats. "You know what people don't talk about," he said, eyes on the sink, tone the one you use when you do talk about something. "Most folks who hear it, they don't go to the river because they love babies or because they're fools. They go because they're tired. The river sounds like rest from a distance." "Did you," I swallowed, "did you lose anyone?" "Not to this," he said. "Not directly. You get a place like this, it has its tally. Most are stupid, a few aren't. I tell people to close their windows because hearing something through a window is different from hearing it in the open. Glass makes a distance you can measure. Once you step through that, it gets harder." "Does anyone ever?" I stopped. The question was wrong, however I asked it. He set the wrench down and took a small wrapped packet from his jacket pocket. "Talked to an elder once who said the hungry ones borrow your mouth to ask for your breath. Not just here. Lots of waters have a hunger. Ours just has a story that fits the way this river hugs the walls." He unwrapped the packet and shook 2 small square tablets into his palm. "You might be sick later. Swallow these with a lot of water. Clean water." He smiled at his own gallows joke and then stopped. "You should go into town tonight. Sleep where the walls have other people attached to them." "I came here to record," I said, and the version of me who said that sounded small. "You already did?" he said, nodding toward the recorder on the counter. "You also came here to not be alone with whatever was following you in the quiet. You got proof the quiet's louder out here." After he left, I played the file from the night before. The microphones had done their job too well. wind, rain, my footsteps heavy with the knowledge of themselves, the river making itself into voice after voice, a snake of sound sliding out of one mouth into another, and underneath that, a thinner thread, which may have been my own humming, or may have been the second voice that had tried to harmonize with it. On the track, the voices parted the way water parts around a rock, and in the little space they made between themselves, something else spoke. It was as faint as the sound a finger makes when it writes a word on a steamy mirror. It wasn't my name. It was a word I had not taught my mouth, Mama. I didn't pack in a rush. I folded the wet clothes into a plastic bag and set it carefully in the bottom of my suitcase. I wrapped the microphones in towels and patted them like fragile children. I emptied the fridge and carried the trash bag out because leaving a place behind badly makes it follow you. I slid the key under the doormat the way the caretaker had shown me. On the deck, near the railing, something had left a gift. A fish the length of my hand, laid out as if asleep, its side slit with a neatness that did not belong to any animal I knew. Beside it sat a stone polished flat by water, the kind you could skip if the water let you. "Thank you," I said, because manners might be a kind of doorway we walk ourselves through. I picked up the stone. I left the fish for the hawk to solve. In town, the motel room's heater ran with a sound like a bad idea, getting worse. The walls were thin. A man coughed in the next room with gusto. A woman laughed in the way you laugh when you want to make sure someone hears you laughing. I set the recorder on the little table as if it were a person. I went into the bathroom and turned the sink on and off 3 times, and it did as it was told, and the silence it left behind was the silence of valves and copper, not the silence of water thinking. Sleep was a place, and I found the door to it. I woke after midnight to a sound I couldn't place. Not the river. A squeak, a soft tap, a sigh. I lay very still and listened, and then understood it. The little refrigerator in the corner running and stopping and running again. I laughed then, just a little, a clean laugh, surprised and short, not the kind I'd made in the dark before. In the morning, I bought coffee so strong I could taste the color brown in it. I went to the highway and turned the wrong way first, and then the right way, and then drove until the radio stations changed dialects and the canyon widened behind me, like a wound trying to heal from both edges to the center. When I got home, my city apartment with its 3rd-floor view of other people's windows and roofs, I set the recorder on my kitchen counter and didn't listen to any of the files for a week. I watered the plants I always overwatered. I put the stone from the river on my desk as a paperweight for papers that blew away anyway. The first night, when the pipes in my building clanked and groaned and made their little metallic arguments, I pressed my face into my pillow and told myself they were just pipes, and sometimes it helped. On the 8th day, I sat down and played the files. I noted times and weather conditions and locations the way you do when you are trying to make something into data. I charted the crying by frequency, by interval, by the way the wind altered its pitch. I cataloged the moments I spoke, the moments the water answered, the moments when the microphones recorded not what was there, but what I had already decided would be. Late in the 2nd hour of the 3rd night's track, after the humming and the gasps and the rough drag of my coat over rock, there was a sound I had not heard there in the water. It was faint, enough buried that I might have missed it if I had already decided to stop listening. A faint tap, then another, then a third, careful, polite, patient, glass against glass. The recorder's red light glowed on my countertop, and in the reflection on its small black screen, a shadow slid like a hand. Out in the living room, behind the blinds, rain began, slicking the night until it held its own light. I sat very still and listened, the way you listen when you know the edge lies. Somewhere below my floor, the building's pipes shifted and sighed and walked themselves into silence. The taps came again, softer now, so soft they could have been memory, at my kitchen window. I did not go to it. I did not close the blinds or open them. I closed my eyes and pressed my own palm to the cold tabletop and hummed, a foolish sound in a warm room, something with no words. Because if there was anyone left in the world to be sung to, it wasn't only down in that river. The taps stopped. I opened my eyes. The recorder's red light kept its patient vigil. I put my fingers on the stone paperweight, and it fit my hand exactly. the way a thing you keep too long sometimes grows to. When I rose to brush my teeth before bed, the bathroom mirror held my face without commentary. I leaned closer, traced the shallow hollow just under my eyes, the small new line that had arrived like a visitor you didn't know you were expecting. I let the faucet run until the water went clear and cold. When I turned it off, it did not drip. But as I reached to switch off the light, something else reached, too, quiet as breath, thin as a thread of water. And for a second I felt not alone, not menaced, just considered. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a possibility. And something in me reached back, not with my hand, which knew better, but with a thought that sounded like a lullaby. You add a second voice to simply because the room is large enough to hold it. If I hear crying again, I will close the window. I will. I tell myself that. I tell myself the edge lies. I tell myself I know which sound is mine.